Every Pokémon game carries within it a layer that most players never fully see. The world feels bright and welcoming on the surface, filled with routes and towns and creatures that seem almost too cheerful to be anything but simple companions. But beneath that warmth, written quietly into Pokédex entries and hidden within lore that rarely announces itself, there are things that do not entirely belong to daylight. These are the dark secrets of Pokémon, the truths the series never quite explains aloud. And before we continue our journey, please consider subscribing to join the Cozy Club for more journey like this, and let me know where in the world you are currently watching from tonight. Not every shadow in these games is accidental. Some were placed there with intention, written carefully by designers who understood that a world feels more real when it contains things that unsettle you just slightly. What follows is an unhurried walk through those places, the ones that sit at the edge of what Pokémon is willing to say. The Pokédex has always been the place where the series allows itself to whisper. It is presented as a scientific instrument, a record of observations gathered by trainers and researchers across every known region. But the entries collected within it to describe a world that does not entirely match the cheerful adventure the games present on their surface. Haunter, the ghost-type Pokémon encountered early in the original games, has entries that describe its touch as capable of inducing a slow and unrecoverable numbness. The creature does not simply frighten its targets. According to the records kept about it, prolonged contact with a Haunter will drain the life from a person in a way that cannot be reversed. This detail sits quietly beneath the game's otherwise gentle tone, never addressed by any trainer or professor, simply recorded and left to be read. The observation is presented without alarm. There are no warnings issued when a player encounters Haunter for the first time, no indication that the creature sharing the screen with a young protagonist carries that particular quality. The Pokédex records it the way a naturalist might record the venom of an insect, as a fact of the world rather than a cause for concern. What makes this pattern interesting is not any single entry, but the accumulation of them. Across hundreds of Pokémon and dozens of games, the Pokédex builds a portrait of a world where extraordinary and sometimes frightening things are simply part of the natural order, cataloged and noted, but never treated as reasons to stop the journey. Gengar, the evolved form of Haunter, is described in various entries as a creature that was once a human being. The transformation is not explained. It is simply stated casually, as if the boundary between person and Pokémon is permeable in ways the games never otherwise acknowledge. This idea surfaces again and again throughout the series, always in the same understated way, dropped into an entry and left for the reader to consider alone. The Pokédex entry for Gengar in one generation notes that if you feel a sudden chill on a warm night, it may be because a Gengar is standing right behind you, grinning. This is written without dramatic music or visual emphasis. The game simply offers the thought and moves on, letting it settle into the background of whatever else the player happens to be doing at the time. There is something deliberately unsettling about that approach. The information is delivered with the same calm register used to describe a Pokémon's diet or its preferred habitat. The tone never shifts, and that evenness is precisely what gives these entries their quiet weight. They do not try to frighten you. They simply tell you things, and the telling is enough. Cubone is among the most melancholy creatures in the entire series, and the story written around it touches something that many players encounter as children and carry quietly into later years. The skull it wears on its head belongs to its mother. This fact is stated plainly in the Pokédex, without ceremony, as a feature of the creature rather than a tragedy to be processed. The entries go further. Cubone is described as crying at night, a sound that reportedly resembles a human infant, the grief audible even to those who do not know the source of it. The cries are said to intensify whenever Cubone gazes at the full moon, which the creature does habitually, looking upward at a light it seems to associate with the parent it has lost. The detail that the skull fits perfectly suggests it has been worn for long enough to conform to the shape of the creature beneath it. There is something in that image that lingers even after the Pokédex entry is closed and the journey continues. The game does not ask you to feel anything in particular about Cubone. It simply gives you this information and trusts that you will know what to do with it. Marowak, the evolved form of Cubone, complicates the story further. In the original games, a ghost encountered in Lavender Town's Pokémon Tower is identified as a Marowak, the mother of a specific Cubone that has been orphaned by the criminal organization operating beneath the town. The ghost cannot rest. It cannot leave. It has been separated from its child and remains unmoving in the place where it died. The player defeats this ghost not to vanquish an enemy, but to free it. There is no reward beyond passage. The ghost dissolves, and the tower quiets, and the game moves forward without acknowledging that anything unusual has just occurred. A grieving parent was held between worlds, and a child somewhere above was wearing the evidence of that loss on its head, and all of this was handled with the same matter-of-fact pacing used for every other obstacle in the game. The weight of that narrative has stayed with players for decades. It is not the darkest thing Pokémon has ever done, but it is among the most quietly human, a small story about grief and separation told without sentimentality, embedded in a children's game that never once asked you to notice it. Lavender Town itself carries associations that have grown far beyond anything the game's designers placed there deliberately. The music composed for that area has become one of the most discussed pieces of game audio in the entire medium, not for its technical qualities, but for the atmosphere it generates. The melody is high and strange, and does not resolve in the way that comfortable music tends to resolve. It leaves you in a state of mild unease. The town exists for a specific purpose within the world of the games. It is the place where Pokémon are buried, a respite from battle culture, a reminder that the creatures trainers carry with them are mortal. The tower at the center of town is a monument to that mortality, a structure full of graves and ghost-type Pokémon that drift among the memorials. What the game communicates through Lavender Town is something the series rarely addresses so directly. Pokémon can die. The world these games portray is not one where loss has been eliminated or softened into abstraction. The graves are real. The grief expressed by the Pokémon Tower's music and architecture is genuine, and the player is asked to walk through it without guidance, finding their own way to the other side. The music in Lavender Town has been described in countless ways over the years, but the description that comes closest might simply be that it sounds like something that wants to be heard. It has a persistence to it, a quality that does not invite you to stop listening, but also does not offer the comfort that most game music provides. It occupies a space that games rarely try to occupy, somewhere between memorial and warning. The stories that grew up around the Lavender Town music over the years, the urban legends and creepypastas and theories, are themselves a kind of testament to how effectively that atmosphere was created. Players felt something specific when they entered that town, something not quite named by any single element, but present nonetheless, and they have been trying to describe it ever since. The town's function as a burial site gives every encounter within it a different texture. When ghost-type Pokémon appear in Lavender Town, they are not simply wild creatures to be caught. They are the inhabitants of a graveyard, shapes that belong to that specific location the way fog belongs to low ground. The game earns the unease it creates there because it builds it out of coherent, internally logical pieces. The Pokémon known as Spirit Omb is bound to a special keystone through a punishment recorded to have taken place 500 years before any trainer encounters it. The Pokédex notes that it was formed from the fusion of 108 spirits, each of them a being that was bound into that stone as a consequence of misdeeds. The number 108 is not arbitrary. It corresponds to the number of earthly desires in certain Buddhist traditions, the number of times a bell is rung at the New Year in Japan to drive away those desires. Spiritomb is essentially a monument to wrongdoing. The creature has no weaknesses under the type system as it existed when it was introduced. This mechanical detail reinforces the mythological one. Something composed entirely of the malicious and the unrepentant cannot be easily overcome by ordinary means. The type system is used here to tell a story, rather than simply to balance gameplay, and the story it tells is about the difficulty of addressing genuine harm. Spiritomb's appearance is unsettling in a way that is hard to attribute to any single feature. The faces visible within its smoky form are numerous and varied, suggesting that the spirits within it retain some individuality, even in their fused state. They are not dissolved, they are gathered. That distinction matters because it means the harm that was done to create Spiritomb has not been resolved, only contained, and contained imperfectly at that. The way the game handles Spiritomb is characteristic of how Pokémon addresses its darker material. The creature exists. Its history is recorded. Players can catch it and add it to their teams. And none of this is treated as inconsistent with the series' generally optimistic tone. The world of Pokémon contains things that were punished for wrongdoing, and now persist as something other than what they were, and this is simply a feature of that world, noted in the Pokédex and left to sit. The punishment that created Spiritomb was apparently administered by someone with the authority and means to bind 108 spirits into a single stone. The games do not identify this figure, do not explain the nature of the crimes involved, do not say whether the binding was considered just or excessive. These questions are left open, which is the series' characteristic approach to the uncomfortable corners of its mythology. The facts are given without context sufficient to judge them. There is a Pokémon called Phantump that looks small and harmless, a ghost drifting through forests with the stump of a tree balanced on its head. The Pokédex entry for Phantump in the generation that introduced it notes that the creature is formed when the spirit of a child who died in a forest takes possession of a tree stump. The game says this without elaboration, without softening, presenting it as a natural phenomenon of the Pokémon world in the same register used to describe how a Pokémon feeds. The implication is that forests in the Pokémon world contain a certain number of children who did not make it back out. The Trevenant that Phantump eventually evolves into continues the theme, described as a spirit that controls trees in order to trap those who would harm the forest. It uses its forest to ensnare people. The player catches and trains these creatures without the game ever asking whether this relationship should feel strange. Phantump's cry is said to sound like a child's voice. The entries note that hearing it causes those who listen to become convinced that a child is calling for help from somewhere in the trees. There is something in this particular detail that the series handles very carefully by not handling it at all. It is simply stated, the sound is like a child. The spirit within the stump was a child. The connection is left for the listener to make alone in whatever quiet moment they find themselves reading the Pokédex. The forests of the Pokémon world are full of creatures like this, beings that exist at the intersection of the natural world and some process that the games have never fully illuminated. Ghost-type Pokémon in general occupy a space the series refuses to explain with any precision. What happens to a spirit after it forms a Pokémon? Do they retain memory of who they were? The games decline to answer, and the declining is itself part of what makes the question feel significant. Trevenant's behavior as a protector of forests introduces a moral dimension that the series rarely makes explicit. It traps and harms people who damage trees. The games present this without taking a position on whether this is justified, leaving the player to consider whether a creature formed from a child's spirit that now exists to defend the natural world represents justice, tragedy, or something in between those things. The Pokédex records the behavior. The interpretation is yours. The story of the Pokémon Tower and what lies beneath Lavender Town reaches into territory that the games depict without ever fully illuminating. Beneath the memorial structure and the graves, the criminal organization that operates through most of the original games has established a presence, using the proximity to the deceased as cover for operations that have nothing to do with mourning. The juxtaposition is deliberately unsettling. Grief serves as concealment. The place where trainers come to honor their Pokémon has been hollowed out by those who see utility in that emotional weight. The game frames this as villainy without pausing to let the player absorb how dark that particular detail actually is. Ghastly and Honor appear throughout the tower as wild Pokémon, and their presence in a burial structure is entirely consistent with their nature as described in the Pokédex. They are drawn to places associated with death. This is simply where they live. The game establishes this naturalistically, making the ghost-type encounters feel like an organic part of the tower's ecosystem rather than a threat artificially introduced for dramatic effect. The ghost in the tower, who cannot move on, adds a human element to all of this. It is not a creature of the natural world. It is a specific individual with a specific grief, held in a specific place by specific circumstances. When the player resolves those circumstances, the ghost disappears without ceremony. There's no conversation, no final message, no acknowledgement of what was released. The game simply lets the moment pass, and the player continues upward. That restraint is part of what gives the sequence its lasting power. The game trusts the player to understand what happened without being told how to feel about it. The narrative is delivered through action and atmosphere rather than dialogue, which is the only way that kind of emotional material can land in the register it is aiming for. Words would have made it smaller. Yamask carries a mask that is said to have been the face of the human it was in a previous life. This is stated flatly in the Pokédex, which goes on to note that Yamask sometimes stops to look at Themisk and cries when overcome by memories of the life it once lived. The creature is in mourning for itself, for what it was before whatever process transformed it into what it now is. The games do not explain the mechanism of that transformation. They do not say what kind of person Yamask was, whether the transformation was voluntary or imposed, or whether the creature retains enough of its former consciousness to understand its situation fully. The Pokédex records the behavior, the tears, the lingering attachment to a face that now hangs from its appendage rather than being worn in the way it once was. Cofagrigus, the evolution of Yamask, is described as a creature that swallows those who come too close and turns them into mummies. This is presented alongside its coffin-like appearance, without particular alarm, as one might note that a frog catches insects or that a spider wraps its prey. The darkness of the content is normalized by the register in which it is delivered, which is the Pokédex's consistent method. The connection between Yamask and ancient Egypt is not incidental. The games draw explicitly on Egyptian burial traditions, on the concept of preserving the dead, on the careful attention to the continuation of the self beyond physical dissolution. But they locate these traditions within a creature that is genuinely suffering, genuinely grieving, not simply performing grief as a Gothic aesthetic choice. The mask is real evidence of a real loss, and the tears are apparently real responses to real memory. What the Yamask line represents within the series is a meditation on what persists. The face persists. The memory persists. The attachment persists. Everything that made a specific individual recognizable survives the transformation, but in a form that cannot go back. The creature cannot wear the face it carries. It can only look at it and remember. The Pokémon known as Mimikyu conceals itself beneath a ragged imitation of Pikachu's appearance, and the reason it does so is among the most quietly heartbreaking facts in the entire series. Mimikyu wants to be loved. It lives in darkness because its true appearance causes those who see it to become ill with shock and fear. It created the disguise by studying an old, faded poster of Pikachu, working from a deteriorated image to construct something that might let it approach the world without causing harm. The Pokédex notes that if the disguise is damaged, Mimikyu will work frantically through the night to repair it before anyone sees what lies beneath. This detail about the nighttime repair work suggests a creature with genuine awareness of its situation. One that understands it is performing a kind of deception, not out of malice, but out of desperation for connection. The disguise itself is described as poorly made. The head sits at a wrong angle. The proportions are off. Anyone looking carefully can tell it is a costume, rather than the creature it imitates. But Mimikyu continues to wear it regardless, because imperfect approximation is better than the alternative, which is to exist exactly as it is and watch others recoil. What the game does with this story is interesting, because Mimikyu is not positioned as pitiable in the way a character in a novel might be. It is positioned as a trainable companion, a creature that can be caught and carried and used in battle. The player's relationship with Mimikyu operates on a practical level, while the Pokédex operates on a more existential one, and the two registers coexist without resolution. The fact that the disguise is based on an old and degraded image of Pikachu is a detail that rewards consideration. Mimikyu does not have access to the current, polished version of the image it is imitating. It is working from something worn and partial, doing its best with incomplete information. There is something in that circumstance that feels recognizable in ways that games do not, and perhaps should not try to articulate. The Pokémon world has a relationship with death that the games explore most directly in how they handle the Ghost-type classification. Ghost-type Pokémon are consistently described in terms of their association with death, decay, transformation, and the persistence of something after physical dissolution. They are not simply scary creatures. They are creatures that exist at the boundary the games acknowledge without ever clearly defining. Shedinja is perhaps the most philosophically strange creature in this category. It emerges not from an egg or a wild encounter, but from the evolution of Ninkata into Ninjask, left behind in the empty shell. The Pokédex describes it as a husk that inexplicably began moving. Its back has an opening, and the entries caution that looking through that opening will steal your spirit away. The game gives Shedinja a single hit point, regardless of any stat modifications. It cannot be increased. The creature exists in a state of mechanical fragility that mirrors its narrative one, something that should not be moving and that will collapse if touched correctly, sustained by nothing explicable, hovering at the edge of dissolution the way something borrowed from one category of existence and placed in another tends to hover. Giratina is described in the Pokédex as having been banished to the distortion world for its violence. This is a creature of antimatter and reversed physics, existing in a dimension where the normal rules of space and time do not apply, and it was sent there specifically because it could not coexist with the world it came from. The games never quite say what Giratina did to merit this exile. They note that it was violent. They note that it was sent away. The enormity of that circumstance is left for the player to fill in. The distortion world. it inhabits is one of the most visually unsettling environments in the series, a place where gravity operates in multiple directions simultaneously, where platforms hang in empty space without support, where the logic of physical existence has been turned and folded in ways that feel genuinely alien. Giratina moves through this space with ease. It is at home there in a way that underscores the distance between its nature and the nature of the world from which it was removed. What Giratina's situation suggests about the Pokémon universe is something the games approach only obliquely. There are forces in this world powerful enough to create a deity-class being and then exile it to a dimension of inverted matter. The exile was considered appropriate. Whatever was done was considered serious enough to warrant permanent separation from the world of the living. The games leave the details unspoken, which means the weight of that decision falls entirely on the imagination. Darkrai causes nightmares. This is described throughout its Pokédex entries, with a precision that is unusual even by the series' standards. The entries note that Darkrai does this not out of malice, but simply because its nature generates nightmares wherever it rests. The creature cannot help what it does. Proximity to Darkrai means terror in sleep, and the Pokédex notes that even Darkrai itself is tormented by this quality, unable to approach others without causing them to suffer. This detail transforms Darkrai from a simple villain creature into something more complicated. The games used Darkrai as a narrative antagonist in the film associated with its generation, a figure initially suspected of causing harm before the true situation is revealed. But beneath that narrative role, the Pokédex is telling a quieter story about a creature that exists in genuine isolation, unable to make contact without causing the very thing it most likely would not choose to cause. There is a loneliness written into Darkrai's existence that the series acknowledges without dwelling on it. The creature lives alone by necessity. The connection between its nature and its isolation is not framed as punishment, but as simple consequence, the way a deep-sea creature lives in darkness because that is where it exists, rather than because it prefers the dark. Darkrai does not prefer to be alone. It simply cannot be otherwise. The relationship between Darkrai and Cresselia mirrors this. Cresselia is described as capable of dispelling the nightmares Darkrai creates, its crescent wings offering relief from the terror of Darkrai's proximity. The two creatures are placed in opposition, not as enemies exactly, but as counterweights, one generating distress and the other capable of dissolving it. Together they form a system, though the game never assembles them in a way that would allow that system to achieve equilibrium. Cresselia's feathers, when left behind, are said to bring pleasant dreams. This detail is the exact inversion of Darkrai's situation, and the inversion is too precise to be accidental. The designers placed these two creatures in deliberate tension with each other, acknowledging that the ability to cause suffering and the ability to relieve it can exist as equally natural phenomena, neither chosen nor rejected, simply present in the world, encircling each other at a careful distance. The Pokémon Absol is described as a creature that appears shortly before natural disasters occur. This has caused people throughout the history of its world to regard Absol as a creature that brings disaster, a harbinger rather than a witness. The Pokédex entries address this misunderstanding carefully, noting that Absol senses the disaster and appears in order to warn people, not to cause what it is announcing. The tragedy of Absol's situation is the tragedy of the messenger. It appears with information and is blamed for the events it could not prevent. The creature lives in remote mountain areas, specifically because contact with people results in fear and persecution despite everything it is attempting to do. It has retreated from the populations it was trying to serve because the response to its warnings was to turn against it. This is a dark piece of social commentary embedded in a creature that most players encounter as a sleek and visually striking wild Pokémon. The games do not make the point explicitly. They record the situation, record the misunderstanding, and allow the implication to rest there. Whether the player connects the observation about Absol to anything outside the game is left entirely open. The relationship between Absol and human misunderstanding is not resolved by the games. There is no moment in which the regions Absol inhabits come to understand what it has been doing and offer it the welcome it might have deserved. The situation simply persists, as many situations in the Pokémon world simply persist, recorded and noted, but not corrected, part of the texture of a world that contains both beauty and ongoing injustice. Absol's mega evolution gives it wings, though it cannot fly with them. The wings are described as manifestations of the disaster energy the creature absorbs, a visual representation of everything it has witnessed and carried. The creature gains something that looks like freedom, but does not function as freedom. This seems entirely consistent with what the games have already established about Absol's situation, a detail that rhymes with the story already told. There is a mountain in the original games that has become one of the most analyzed locations in the entire series because of what is found at its peak. Mount Pyre in later games, Victory Road in others, but it is the peak of Mount Silver, and what waits there that carries a particular weight. It is empty of everything except a single trainer standing in the snow, surrounded by the strongest team in the game, having waited there since the conclusion of his own journey. Red does not speak. He has nothing to say. He has reached a point beyond the narrative, standing at a height where the world below no longer requires anything from him, and what he offers the player who climbs to find him is only the battle, the test, the measurement of whether the journey you have taken is comparable to the one he completed before you arrived. The silence is the point. Red's inability or unwillingness to speak is not a game design limitation presented as character depth, but rather a game design choice that communicates something true about what it means to have finished something. He has been here long enough that language no longer seems to be what the moment requires. The fact that he is standing alone in snow at an elevation where survival would be genuinely difficult for a normal person is never addressed. The game presents it without explanation, asking you to accept that someone has been here for a long time, waiting, and that the waiting is neither pathetic nor pointless, but simply what this particular figure does in the space after the story is technically over. This quiet piece of characterization has influenced how players have thought about Red across every subsequent appearance, every game in which his image surfaces or his legend is referenced. He became something through that silence that no amount of dialogue could have created. The game understood that and withheld the words accordingly. The Pokémon named Drifloon presents its darkest information calmly. It is described as a creature that lures children away by allowing itself to be grabbed, its light body drifting upward and carrying its young passengers toward places from which they do not return. The Pokédex notes this clearly. The game does not add narrative context. Drifloon simply does this, and the balloon-like creature that floats through game routes on Fridays carries this quality embedded in its Pokédex entry while the adventure continues around it. The visual design of Drifloon is worth noting here. It is bright and cheerful looking, obviously balloon-shaped, with features that are clearly intended to be appealing to children in exactly the way the creature is designed to appeal to children within its own world. The game has made a creature that looks safe and has embedded in its lore the specific reason that appearance is dangerous. The disconnect between visual impression and cataloged fact is what gives the entry its particular texture. Drifblum, the evolution of Drifloon, is described as carrying souls away on evenings when the wind blows in a certain direction. The creatures travel in groups at dusk. Their destinations are unknown. The Pokédex notes that not all of them arrive wherever they are going, which raises questions about what happens to the souls being carried when the carrier itself is lost. These questions are not answered. The entry moves on, the player moves on, the world continues. This pattern of cheerful appearance, paired with genuinely troubling lore, appears throughout the series and represents one of the ways Pokémon manages to inhabit two tones simultaneously. On the surface, it is a bright adventure about partnership and discovery. In the Pokédex, read carefully, it is something considerably more complicated, a world full of creatures whose natural behaviors include things that would be considered horror if they happened in a more explicitly dark story. The ancient Pokémon Kabuto and Omanite were revived from fossils in the original games, brought back from extinction through technology, and made available as companions. The games treated this as a scientific achievement, an exciting feature, a sign of the world's sophistication. The Pokédex added something else. Kabuto entries in certain generations note that despite being extinct for hundreds of millions of years, some of these creatures were found still alive. They did not need to be revived. They had simply persisted, unchanging, in conditions that should not have allowed for survival. The implication is that something about Kabuto did not entirely participate in the extinction that ended its era. Aerodactyl entries describe a creature restored from ancient DNA that immediately attempts to return to its ancient way of life, which involved behaviors considerably more violent than the games typically accommodate. The creature was revived into a world it does not recognize, and its response to that situation is not adaptation, but resistance, an attempt to behave the way it behaved before the world that shaped it disappeared. What the fossil Pokémon suggest collectively is that extinction is not as final as it might appear, and that things brought back from before do not necessarily arrive prepared to be part of the after. The games use this as a gameplay feature, and occasionally as an adventure story element, but the Pokédex treats it with the same quiet gravity it applies to everything else, recording that these creatures are out of place without resolving what that displacement means for them. The DNA that resurrects fossil Pokémon is described in some entries as imperfect, incomplete, working from fragments rather than complete information. What emerges is close to what existed before, but not identical. The question of whether what comes out is truly the same creature that went in, or something new that resembles it in most important respects, is one the games decline to address directly, which is itself a kind of answer. Mewtwo was created in a laboratory and knows it. This is unusual in the Pokémon world, where most creatures seem to accept their existence without the self-consciousness that Mewtwo displays. The journals found in the Pokémon Mansion on Cinnabar Island document the process, the generations of research, the escalating interventions in Mew's DNA, the eventual emergence of something that exceeded every expectation and could not be controlled. The entries in those journals do not use the language of regret until they need to, until the creature begins destroying the lab from the inside, until the researchers who created it find themselves unable to manage what they have made. The final entries are brief and suggest that the situation deteriorated faster than anyone anticipated. The lab is abandoned by the time the player arrives, and Mewtwo is gone, but the journals remain, evidence of the calculation that preceded catastrophe. Mewtwo's Pokédex entries describe a creature that is the result of genetic splicing, that has the most ferocious powers of any Pokémon, and that is said to be a single-minded destroyer when it is not being directed. The games do not reconcile this description with the fact that the player can catch and train Mewtwo as a companion. The creature described in the Pokédex and the creature that follows instructions in battle are apparently the same being, and the games leave the tension between those two states unresolved. In the film associated with Mewtwo, the creature's psychology is explored with a directness that the games avoid. Mewtwo asks why it was created, what purpose it is meant to serve, whether the circumstances of a birth that was not chosen determine the nature of the life that follows. These questions are handled in the animated film with more emotional directness than the games typically permit themselves, which suggests that the games understand the weight of what they have created, but prefer to leave it in the Pokédex rather than stage it directly. The burned tower in Ecruteak City references a different kind of creation, the three legendary beasts who were resurrected by Ho-Oh after dying in a fire. They were mortal creatures before that event, and are not mortal afterward, changed completely by the circumstances of their death and the nature of what brought them back. The games treat this as mythology, as ancient history, but the tower's ruins are present in the game world as physical evidence that this transformation actually occurred. What the legendary beasts represent within the mythology of their region is something the games approach differently in different generations, but the core of the story is consistent. 3 creatures died. Something of enormous power restored them into something they had not been. They were not asked. The transformation simply happened to them, and now they run, and the running is perhaps all they know to do with the situation they find themselves in. The region of Alola contains a category of Pokémon called Ultra Beasts, creatures that do not originate in the standard Pokémon world, but pass through dimensional rifts called Ultra Wormholes. The Ultra Beasts are classified separately from ordinary Pokémon, treated by the games as a category requiring special protocols and dedicated organizations for management. The dark element here is not in the Ultra Beasts themselves, but in what the games reveal about one of them specifically. Nihilego is an Ultra Beast with properties that intersect with the backstory of one of the game's central antagonists. The creature releases a neurotoxin that stimulates the behavior of whatever it bonds with, encouraging risk-taking and disregard for self-preservation, functioning essentially as a substance that removes inhibitions in the direction of harm rather than pleasure. The game reveals that the primary villain of Alola's story was bonded with Nihilego as a child, exposed to its influence during a formative period, and that what appeared to be ambition and ruthlessness was at least partially the result of that exposure. The revelation complicates the villainy significantly. The character was harmed. The harm shaped a disposition. The disposition resulted in actions that harmed others. The chain of causation is presented without easy moral resolution. The games acknowledge this complexity and then ask the player to complete the story anyway. The villain must be stopped regardless of the circumstances that created the villainy. The mother who enabled the original exposure must be confronted. The Ultra Beasts must be contained. And none of this can be undone. Not the initial bonding, not the childhood exposure, not the years of behavior that followed. The games do what the games always do with difficult material. They record it and continue. There is a phenomenon in certain Pokémon games called the distortion world, mentioned previously in relation to Giratina, but the nature of that space merits further consideration on its own terms. The distortion world is described as a dimension consisting of antimatter, existing in mirror relationship to the standard Pokémon world. What is up there is down here. What exists as matter in one world exists as antimatter in the other. Giratina was banished there and has become its representative, its guardian in some framings. The creature's design reflects the dimension it inhabits, with a form that appears different depending on which world it occupies, as though its body has adapted to the physics of the space rather than remaining constant between environments. The philosophical implication of the distortion world's existence is that every stable thing in the normal world has an inverted counterpart somewhere, and that the stability of the one depends on the existence of the other. This is not stated explicitly by the games, but is implied by the structural relationship between Giratina, the entity of antimatter, and Dialga and Palkia, the entities of time and space. The three are complementary rather than simply oppositional. One was removed. The system continued. But the removed element was not destroyed, merely displaced, and its displacement is what keeps the balance. The games otherwise never quite show you the seams of. The entrance to the distortion world is found in the basement of a building called Turnback Cave, which has the property of looping back on itself when traversed incorrectly. Players who enter the cave without knowing its rules will circle through it repeatedly, encountering the same rooms in shifting configurations, unable to progress without the specific sequence of choices the cave requires. It is a maze that punishes confusion with repetition. The games do not explain the cave's relationship to the distortion world beneath it, but the coincidence of place seems carefully chosen. Pokémon are capable of experiencing emotions that their trainers may not always be in a position to recognize. The games establish this through the friendship and affinity systems that govern how certain Pokémon evolve, but the Pokédex goes considerably further in documenting the emotional and psychological lives of these creatures. Espeon is described as having developed psychic abilities, specifically in response to devotion to its trainer, its powers expanding as its loyalty deepens. The biological mechanism of that expansion is not explained. The devotion simply produces the ability, as though the emotional reality of the relationship has physical consequences that the creature's body registers and responds to. Umbreon is described as having developed its abilities through the conditions under which it was raised, through the bond that formed in specific circumstances, through the light of the moon during nights spent close to those it was attached to. The dark energy that Umbreon channels is something it absorbed from the environment during a period of emotional intensity. The emotions left a residue. The residue became a power. Well, what the evolutions suggest collectively is that Pokémon development is not determined entirely by genetics or environment in isolation, but by the intersection of internal state and external condition, by what the creature is feeling when the world presents the circumstances that will shape what it becomes. This is a sophisticated theory of development embedded in the evolutionary mechanics of a children's game, and it sits there quietly beneath the surface of what appears to be simply a feature about how certain Pokémon transform. The connection between emotional state and physical form appears throughout the series in ways that the games rarely make fully explicit. Gardevoir grows from a small creature into one described as willing to use all of its power to protect the person it has formed the deepest bond with, described in terms that do not shy away from the intensity of that attachment. The Pokédex notes that Gardevoir will create a small black hole if that is what the situation requires. The capacity for that kind of intervention is apparently what devotion looks like when it has had time to develop. The concept of Pokéballs carries implications that the games have always handled by declining to address them at all. The balls reduce Pokémon to some form that can be transported in a small sphere, and the Pokémon within them apparently exist in a state that is livable, or at least survivable, because otherwise the entire adventure would collapse under the weight of the obvious question. Certain Pokédex entries and game mechanics hint at what the interior of a Pokéball might actually be like. Some entries describe the space inside as comfortable as a world the Pokémon can inhabit without distress. Others, in passing, use language that suggests the process of being captured is associated with something more ambiguous than simple comfort. The Ghost-type Pokémon are particularly interesting in this context because their status as beings partially outside the physical world raises questions about whether the mechanisms that work on ordinary Pokémon work the same way on them. A creature that exists partly as a spirit that passes through solid matter that is already in some sense not entirely present in the world, in the same way a Pikachu is present in the world, being compressed into a small sphere by a mechanism designed for physical matter. The games do not address this. They simply allow it to work and move on. The Master Ball is described as capable of catching any Pokémon without fail. The games provide exactly one of these in most titles, where they appear or make them extraordinarily rare. The scarcity is practical, but the implication is worth noting. The mechanism for absolute capture exists. There is something that can reduce any creature of any power level to a containable state. The games have placed an absolute limit on Pokémon sovereignty and then distributed that limit sparingly, which is a choice rather than a necessity. Pokeballs aside, the question of what Pokémon understand about their situation is one the games approach from interesting angles without ever resolving it. The games establish that Pokémon and humans have coexisted for an enormous length of time, that the relationship between them is complex and long-standing, and that within it there are Pokémon who are happy and Pokémon who are not, Pokémon who choose to stay and Pokémon who run. Zoroark is described as a creature that will go to any length to protect those it considers family, specifically a group of Pokémon it has decided to care for. The entries note that Zoroark creates powerful illusions to keep its family hidden and safe, transforming its environment and its own appearance as needed to misdirect threats. The protective instinct is described as fierce to the point where Zoroark will appear to sacrifice itself rather than allow those it protects to be found. The illusions that Zoroark creates are indistinguishable from reality for those without specific means of seeing through them. The games use this as a gameplay mechanic, but the Pokédex frames it as a survival behavior born from the need to protect against genuine threats. The question of what those threats have historically been, what circumstances produced a species that evolved illusion as its primary protective mechanism, is left open. Something in Zoroark's history made this kind of concealment necessary, and the games do not say what. Zorua, the pre-evolution of Zoroark, transforms into the likeness of children and wanders into towns by night. The entries note that it does this in an attempt to make friends, that it wants companions, and adopts the forms it believes will be most likely to result in acceptance. The disguise is not aggressive or predatory. It is lonely, a creature that cannot appear as itself, that has learned through some combination of instinct and circumstance that its true form invites rejection, practicing an approximation of belonging in the dark hours before day. There is a city in the Unova region that carries one of the most explicitly historical references in the series. Castelia City is vast, the largest urban environment in the games at the time of its introduction, a place of industry and commerce and vertical scale that the games use to establish Unova as a modern region in a way previous settings were not. But within the broader mythology of Unova, the games tell a story about origin that complicates the celebration of that modernity. The two legendary Pokémon of Unova, Reshiram and Zekrom, were originally a single creature that was split into two by the conflict between two brothers who founded the region. The brothers had different views on truth and ideals, on which of those values should ground a civilization, and their conflict was severe enough to fracture the being they both drew power from. What was one became two, what was unified became opposed. The games present this mythology to the player through various dialogue and ancient texts, asking you to pick a side and then consider whether the side you picked was simply the other half of an argument that should never have been separated in the first place. The resolution of both games in the Unova set involves the reconciliation of the two perspectives, the recognition that truth and ideals are not genuinely opposed, but interdependent. But that recognition comes after a great deal of damage has already been done. The history of a region shaped by a fundamental schism is darker than the surface of those games typically suggests. The villain of those games is attempting to complete a process of destruction and recreation. He believes the current world is corrupt beyond repair, and that only by burning it away and beginning again, can something worthy be built? The games oppose this conclusion, but take the reasoning seriously enough to present it with real force, asking the player to engage with the argument rather than simply dismiss it. Kyurem, the third legendary creature of Unova, is described as an empty shell, the husk that remains after the original dragon divided. It is without truth or ideals, without the animating quality that gave the original being its nature. What it has instead is cold, immense cold, a chill that fills the absence where something else should be. The creature absorbs people and other Pokémon into itself in ways the games describe without explanation of the mechanism or the experience of what is absorbed. There is an ancient legend within the Unova mythology about a traveler who approached Kyurem seeking power and was incorporated into the creature instead. The legend does not describe escape or rescue. It simply records the approach and in the subsequent absence. Kyurem's castle, the Giant Chasm, is a location that the games treat with unusual care for atmosphere. The cold is described in the environment itself, in the behavior of Pokémon in the surrounding area, in the design of the cave that leads toward the creature's location. The game builds the encounter gradually, which is characteristic of how the series handles its most significant legendary presentations, but feels particularly appropriate for a creature that is itself described as a void rather than a presence. The three forms Kyurem takes when it fuses with Reshiram or Zekrom do not represent the restoration of the original creature. They represent a different kind of partial completion, two incomplete things combining into something that has more of what it needs, but is still not what existed before. The games treat this mechanical fusion as an extraordinary event within the game's story, without pausing on what it means that the original cannot be truly restored, only approximated, only approached from the direction of what remains. The existence of Pokémon that are explicitly classified as having human origins is handled across the series in ways that most players have encountered in passing without necessarily assembling into a coherent observation. Yamask and Fontump have been mentioned already, but the pattern extends significantly further, and the cumulative picture it paints is of a world where the boundary between human and Pokémon has been crossed in multiple directions by multiple mechanisms, few of them voluntary. Kadabra was the subject of a famous claim that a specific person named Uri Geller had been transformed into the creature, a claim that led to legal action and a long period in which Kadabra was not distributed in official events. The claim was not credible in literal terms, but touched something in the way the creature was designed. Kadabra's humanoid posture, its apparent consciousness, and psychic depth, the way it holds the spoon as if aware of the gesture's significance, all of this invites the question the games decline to ask directly. The Pokémon Banette is described as a discarded stuffed animal that became a Pokémon through its own resentment. It was made by a child and loved and then thrown away, and the intensity of its desire for revenge against the child who abandoned it was sufficient to animate the toy into something new. The Pokédex notes that Banette is now devoted to finding the child who threw it away. The search is ongoing. The creature moves through the world in pursuit of the specific target and has apparently been moving since the abandonment occurred. What Banette represents is the consequence of treating something that has developed feeling as though it had none. The toy was made. The making was sufficient to create something that could be hurt. The hurt was sufficient to create a transformation. The transformation created a creature that will not stop looking. The game records this without editorial comment, presenting a kind of haunting that began with an ordinary act of childhood that the child has likely long forgotten. The mythology of Pokémon origin, the question of how the world and its creatures came to exist, is handled through the legendary Pokémon at the apex of each generation's cosmology. Arceus is described in the Pokédex as the creature that shaped the universe by hatching from a single egg in a void before all else existed. The entry is brief and states this without elaboration, which is characteristic of how the series handles its largest concepts. Arceus created Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina to govern time, space, and antimatter. It created Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf to govern knowledge, goods, emotion, and willpower. The cosmology assembled across the Sinnoh games is unusually complete by Pokémon standards, a full account of how a universe was organized and distributed into principles. The games offer this account through ancient texts and ruined architecture, through things that were written down a very long time ago and have survived imperfectly. The darkness implicit in this cosmology is not in the creation itself, but in what the creation means for everything that came after. If Arceus shaped the universe intentionally, then the grief of Kubon, the isolation of Darkrai, the suffering of Yamask, the abandonment that created Banette, all of these are things that exist in a universe whose architect is still present, still described in current game content, still catchable by players who reach the appropriate location. The games do not raise this question. They do not position Arceus as responsible for the suffering embedded in its world, or require the player to consider the relationship between a creator and the pain that exists in the created thing. The theology of the Pokémon universe is presented descriptively rather than critically, which is appropriate for a series that needs to function across cultures and ages. But the question is there, underneath the surface of the mythological facts, available to anyone who assembles the pieces in the right order. There is a Pokémon called Grimer that feeds on the refuse and pollution of industrial areas, described as having been born from toxic sludge that began moving on its own when exposed to specific kinds of contamination. Muk, its evolution, is described as so toxic that plants die simply from the creature moving across their surfaces, that even the ground it has crossed remains poisonous for extended periods. The poison type in general is a category that the games have handled with an interesting duality. These are creatures that contain and sometimes produce things genuinely harmful to living organisms, and the Pokédex records this straightforwardly. But the games also regularly present poison-type Pokémon as companions, as competitive battle assets, as creatures that can form bonds with trainers who care for them. The Tentacruel line is described as having multiple venomous tentacles that it uses to immobilize prey before consuming it. The mechanics of this process are detailed in the Pokédex with a clinical precision that does not soften the reality of what is being described. Tentacruel hunts. It has means of rendering its prey unable to resist. It uses those means as a matter of course. This is presented as its natural behavior, rather than as something that distinguishes it from the companion creatures in the party. Victreebel is described in various entries as luring prey with a sweet fragrance, and then dissolving the prey in an acidic fluid that the plant uses for nutrition. The process is described in enough detail that the reader understands the experience of the prey is not brief. The plant digests slowly. This fact sits in the Pokédex alongside the creature's cheerful green coloring and its accessibility as a grass-type option for the early portions of many games. The insistence on biological accuracy in these entries, on recording what these creatures actually do to eat and survive, is one of the ways the Pokédex functions as a naturalistic document rather than a promotional one. It describes the world as it is, rather than as adventure media might prefer to present it, and the world it describes contains creatures whose survival behaviors overlap significantly with what would be called violence in a different register. The Pokémon known as Chandelure is described as feeding on spirits, rather than on any physical substance. Its flames consume the consciousness of those they envelop, described in the Pokédex as wandering spirits, that are then burned to fuel the creature. The entries note that a body from which the spirit has been consumed will wander aimlessly, continuing to move without purpose or awareness. This is, by any description, one of the darker processes described in the Pokédex. The result of an encounter with Chandelure that goes wrong is not death in the ordinary sense, but something closer to what various traditions call a fate worse than death, the continuation of the physical form without the animating principle that made it a person. The game places this information in the Pokédex and makes Chandelure available as a companion. The player who wins one through evolution will field it in battles without the game ever acknowledging the tension. Litwick, the base form of the line, is described as pretending to guide travelers through darkness while actually leading them in circles, absorbing the life force that leaks from those who are lost, using fear and exhaustion and the energy of disorientation as a food source. The cute candle appearance is the mechanism of the deception. The game made something that looks like it would sit on a windowsill and gives it the behaviors of something considerably more unsettling. Lampent, the middle evolution, is described as haunting hospitals, described as appearing at the bedside of those who are about to die, drawn there by some sensing capacity that allows it to locate life force in its final moments. The creature waits. The entries do not describe the waiting as predatory exactly, but they do not describe it as neutral either. It is there for something, and the something is available only at the specific moment between living and not. The Chandelure line represents the concentrated form of a design approach as the series uses throughout its ghost and dark type categories. The approach of embedding genuinely troubling behavior into visually appealing forms and presenting both without editorial comment. The player is given the information, the player makes the companion battles when asked. The Pokédex entry sits in the archive and waits to be read. There is a specific moment in the 4th generation games that is among the most quietly disturbing sequences in the series, handled with almost no emphasis, occurring in an area the player visits in the service of a plot objective, and leaves again without ceremony. In the basement of a building called the Pokémon Mansion on Hardhome City's outskirts, or in analogous structures and other presentations of the same concept, a researcher who has become too attached to his work remains. The games gesture toward the concept of a trainer who has formed an unhealthy bond with Pokémon research, who has spent years studying creatures to the point where the relationship between researcher and subject has become something else, something the games decline to name precisely. The darkness is in the implication rather than the statement, in the details accumulated through the environment rather than spoken directly. The larger pattern this touches is the relationship between humans and Pokémon when that relationship crosses from partnership into something else. The games draw the healthy version of this relationship consistently and clearly. The trainer and the Pokémon choose each other, work together, grow together, and the bond deepens through shared experience and mutual care. But the Pokédex occasionally describes creatures whose relationships with humans have not looked like this, whose histories with human contact have not resulted in the warm companionship the games celebrate. Houndour and Houndoom are described as creatures that work in coordinated packs, using sophisticated communication systems to surround prey and coordinate attacks with a precision that suggests significant intelligence. The entries note that wounds inflicted by Houndoom produce a lasting burning that does not respond to ordinary treatment. This detail is included alongside descriptions of the creature's pack loyalty and its tendency to care for injured members of its group, creating a portrait of a creature that is simultaneously capable of genuine community and genuine harm. The legendary Pokémon of specific generations carry stories that the games often present through environmental storytelling rather than direct narrative, through ruins and ancient texts and the architecture of places that were important before the current era of the story began. The Regi group, The ancient golems of Huen are sealed away in structures that require specific sequences of actions to open, suggesting that someone in the distant past wanted them sealed and wanted the sealing to be difficult to undo. The Pokédex entries for the Regi group describe creatures of enormous power, describe their bodies as composed of materials and energies that have no natural equivalent, describe them as having been created rather than evolved. Something made them. The something that made them is not named in the entries, which note only that they have been around since ancient times, and that their power is such that the human civilization that existed when they were created decided to seal them rather than allow them to continue operating freely. The decision to seal something rather than destroy it carries implications about what kind of threat the golems represented and what was understood about the limits of human power in relation to them. The civilization that sealed the Regis apparently could not destroy them. The sealing was a practical limit, the most that could be done rather than what would have been preferred. The caves and structures that hold them were built as permanent containment, designed to function long after the civilization that built them was gone. Regigigas, the largest and most powerful of the group, is described in the Pokédex as the creator of the smaller Regis, the being that used blocks of ice and magma and steel to shape the creatures it made. It pulled continents apart and moved them as though they were objects, its entries claim. It exists in a slumbering state that the games present as a form of self-imposed limitation, sealed by those who could not destroy it, and also perhaps by something within itself that recognized the necessity of restraint. The slow start ability that Regigigas carries in battle is a mechanical representation of that restraint, an enormous power that is deliberately hobbled for reasons the game leaves undefined. The creature holds back, and the holding back is built into its nature rather than externally imposed. This is either a design concession to competitive balance or a piece of characterization that suggests the creature with the most power in its category is also the one most aware of what that power could do. The games allow both interpretations. Certain Pokémon games contain locations that are clearly modeled on real places with real histories, and the histories that inform those locations carry weight that the games acknowledge quietly through atmosphere and design. The Unova region is modeled in significant ways on New York City, and the games that take place there engage with themes of conflict, history, and what it means to build a civilization on ground that was not empty before you arrived. The mythology of two brothers whose conflict shaped a region carries the weight of historical conflicts over founding principles. The games use this mythology to tell a story about truth and ideals and the damage done when those concepts are treated as opposed rather than complementary, but underneath that clean philosophical framing is a story about a founding conflict that is never fully resolved, that continues to shape the present in ways the present inhabitants may not fully recognize. The games in the Unova set are among the most explicitly political in the series, engaging with questions about the relationship between humans and Pokémon in ways that earlier titles handled primarily through Pokédex entries and environmental details. The antagonist's position that Pokémon should be liberated from human control, that the companionship the games celebrate is actually a form of exploitation that cannot be justified, is given enough narrative space to function as a genuine argument rather than simply a villain's excuse. The player character refutes this argument through action rather than through dialogue, winning battles and restoring the world order through the demonstration that partnership between humans and Pokémon can be genuine, can be chosen rather than compelled, can be the basis of something worth defending. But the refutation by action does not fully address the philosophical challenge posed by the argument, because winning a fight is not the same as winning the argument the fight is standing in for. The games know this and leave the question open, which is one of the ways they are more sophisticated than they sometimes appear. The Pokémon known as Cofagrigus, encountered in the Unova Desert areas, is described as having evolved to look like a golden coffin because grave robbers would confuse it for a valuable artifact and approach. This is a predatory mimicry that uses human greed as its mechanism. The creature does not need to hunt for its prey in the conventional sense. It only needs to exist, and the nature of its targets will supply the approach. The design carries within it a commentary on the relationship between value and danger, on the assumption that something that looks like treasure is safe to touch. The creature's appearance is rich and ostentatious, clearly intended to attract exactly the kind of person who would reach for it. The Pokédex records that those who touch Cofagrigus are incorporated into it, emerge from the encounter mummified. The treasure and the trap are the same object. The Pokémon named Golurk is a golem of clay, an ancient construction described as having been made by a civilization that no longer exists. It moves under the power of a seal on its chest, and if that seal is broken, the Pokédex warns that the energy within will run out of control. The creature has been traveling through the world, following no discernible purpose, for a period that extends significantly beyond the civilization that made it. Whatever instructions it was given have either been completed or have proven impossible to complete, and what remains is the movement, the continuing operation of something that was built for a purpose that no longer has context. The abandoned purpose expressed by Golurk's situation is quietly sad in the way that ruins are quietly sad, not dramatic in their grief, but present, visible, available to anyone who takes the time to look. The creature is still operating. It is doing what it was made to do in some functional sense, but the world it was made to operate in is gone, and the operating continues into a present that cannot fully recognize what it is seeing when it sees Golurk moving through it. The Pokémon called Aegislash is described as having the ability to manipulate those it considers worthy into positions of power, guiding the trajectory of individuals and nations across generations. The entries note that this manipulation has shaped history in ways that are not fully visible to those who were manipulated. Kings and commanders have been directed by a sword-shaped Pokémon whose agenda, if it has one beyond the accumulation of worthy wielders, is not described in the Pokédex. The implications of this are handled by the games with their characteristic brevity. The creature can influence events at a geopolitical level. It has done so. History has been shaped by a Pokémon operating outside the awareness of the people it was shaping. The entries record this, and the player catches the creature and uses it in battle, and the games do not pause to consider what this historical fact means for the nature of human agency in the world being described. Inkay and Malamar carry a connected dark thread. Malamar is described as having the strongest hypnotic powers of any Pokémon, capable of controlling the actions of those it ensnares with perfect completeness. The entries note that this ability has been used to control humans and force them to act against their will and against their own interests. The creature does this, the Pokédex records, and this is presented as a fact of its nature rather than an aberration. The specific game content associated with Malamar in its generation of introduction features these creatures prominently in the activity of a criminal organization, used as tools for controlling key figures and directing their behavior. The games address this within the plot, but the Pokédex entries treat the ability as inherent, as something Malamar does by nature, which means that the game world outside the plot contains Malamar moving through it without criminal employment, possessing this capability in the general course of its existence. The relationship between Pokémon and time is one of the series' most explored philosophical territories, and it surfaces in ways that carry real weight in the games that treat it most seriously. Dialga controls time and is described as time itself continuing because of Dialga's heartbeat. The distinction between a creature that controls something and a creature whose existence is the thing itself is not made clearly by the entries, which is possibly the point. The implications of Dialga's nature for the existence of everything else are not addressed by the games. If Dialga's heartbeat is time, then the question of what happened before Dialga existed, what time was, or whether time was before the creature that generates it came into being, is a question the games open and leave open. The cosmology handles this by establishing that Arceus preceded everything, which simply moves the question one level higher rather than answering it. Celebi's entries describe a creature that lives across all time simultaneously, described as appearing in forests across every era, moving through time the way most creatures move through space. The detail that Celebi's presence in a forest is a sign that the forest will be at peace is presented as a comforting observation, but the underlying mechanism, a creature that perceives and inhabits all moments simultaneously, is one that most serious engagement with that concept would find vertiginous rather than peaceful. Jirachi is said to wake for 7 days every 1,000 years, granting wishes during the period of its waking. The Pokédex does not describe the nature of the wishes it grants, whether the granting is precise or interpretive, whether what the wisher receives is always what was intended. The tradition of wish-granting beings in myth almost always contains cautionary content about the gap between what is asked and what is received. The Pokémon games note the wishing and decline to follow the wishes through to their consequences. The gap between what is granted and what is wanted is a space the games are generally content to leave empty, which is characteristic of their approach to potentially troubling material. The facts are given, the consequences are implied. The imagination supplies the rest, and the rest is whatever the imagination is prepared to find. The cave called Mount Pyre in the Hoenn region contains an elder couple who guard 2 orbs of ancient power, described as having devoted their lives to protecting these objects from those who would misuse them. The cave is also a cemetery, another location where Pokémon are laid to rest, another place where the games locate significant mythological content within a space dedicated to death and memory. The elder couple's presence there, their devotion to a guardianship that the criminal organization of their generation will eventually overcome, is a quiet story about the fragility of protection. The things they guard will be taken. Their decades of protection will not be sufficient against the force that comes for what they hold. The games do not dwell on this defeat, which is handled as a plot complication to be resolved rather than a tragedy to be mourned. But the couple's situation is genuinely melancholy in ways the games acknowledge through their gentle characterization. The graveyard setting of Mount Pyre pairs the mythological weight of the orbs with the ordinary weight of endings, placing power and grief in the same location the way so many of the game's significant locations place these things together. The cave is associated with death and also with some of the most world-altering objects in the game's mythology, and the game treats this juxtaposition as natural rather than ironic. The Pokémon world's relationship with death, it should be clear by this point, is handled with considerably more seriousness than the bright surfaces of these games would suggest. The burial sites, the ghost-type classifications, the legends of creatures formed from the spirits of the departed, the Pokédex entries that describe creatures whose existence depends on the deaths of others, all of this forms a coherent picture of a world that has integrated the reality of loss into its cosmology, rather than setting it aside as something too difficult for adventure media to address. The region of Kalos carries historical references that the games handle with unusual directness for the series. The war referenced in the backstory of that region involved a weapon of mass destruction powered by enormous numbers of Pokémon lives, built to end a conflict, and succeeding at that goal while creating consequences that persist thousands of years later in the form of specific legendary Pokémon and specific locations marked by what was done there. The weapon is called the Ultimate Weapon. Its operation is described in the game's dialogue and environmental storytelling with enough detail to understand what occurred. An enormous number of Pokémon were sacrificed to power a device that achieved its purpose at a cost that the king who built it spent the subsequent millennia in grief about. The king became immortal through the process, unable to die, unable to rest, condemned to live with what he chose to do. The flower Pokémon Florges were nearly driven to extinction by the war. The landscape was altered. The consequences of the weapon's use were both immediate and ongoing, propagating forward through time in ways that the current era of the game is still dealing with. The legendary Pokémon Yveltal is described as absorbing the life force of all living things around it when it reaches the end of its lifespan, creating a zone of death that converts the absorbed energy into a cocoon from which it eventually reemerges. The cycle is described as natural, as simply what Yveltal does. But the scale of it, the description of all living things within reach being drained of their life force, is an extraordinary thing to embed in a game that otherwise celebrates vitality and growth. Xerneas, the counterpart legendary, is described as capable of granting eternal life to anything it chooses to share its golden light with. The balance between the two legendary creatures of Kalos is the balance between death and continuation, between ending and enduring, and the game's story involves the attempt to weaponize that balance, to use Xerneas' power of continuation in service of a plan that the game's frame clearly is wrong, without making the desire for continuation itself wrong. The game set in the Alola region introduced a mechanic called Zap moves, attacks of extraordinary power that require the bond between trainer and Pokémon to reach a specific intensity before they can be used. The mechanic is built around the idea that exceptional power requires genuine relationship, that the connection between a person and a Pokémon is itself a kind of energy that can be channeled into something larger than either alone could produce. This mechanic is the bright surface. The dark undertone appears when you consider what the Ultra Beasts represent in the same region. If Z moves are about the power generated by deep connection, then the Ultra Beasts are in some sense the inverse, entities from elsewhere whose relationship to connection and to the world they enter is one of radical misalignment. They do not belong here. Their nature is incompatible in various ways with the nature of the world they are entering, and the harm they cause is described as a consequence of that incompatibility rather than of malice. The Ultra Beast called Nihilego has been described already in relation to the game's villain, but Nihilego as a species, as a creature whose nature includes this neurological effect on those it bonds with, is an entity that harms because of what it is, rather than because of what it intends. The games are careful to distinguish this. The harm is not chosen. The harm is the consequence of a nature that was formed somewhere else and cannot help what it does when it arrives in a world that shaped itself differently. The concept of something harmful that cannot be blamed for its harmfulness is one the Pokémon games return to across multiple entries and multiple generations. Darkrai does not choose the nightmares it creates. The Chandelure line does not choose what it needs to eat. The poison types do not choose their toxins. The games make space for creatures that are genuinely dangerous without framing that danger as moral failure, which is a more sophisticated position than it might appear, and one that requires the games to hold two things simultaneously, compassion and caution, without collapsing them into each other. The myths of the Pokémon world are not uniformly ancient. Some of them are recent enough to still be forming, in the sense that the events that will become myths are still within living memory, or recent enough that the historical record is incomplete. The incident at Cinnabar Island, the laboratory and what it created, is mythologized in the game's cultural landscape, even though the journals documenting it still exist in the burned out building. What happened at Cinnabar is not ancient history, it is recent history, and the reason it feels mythological is that the thing created there became larger than the historical record surrounding its creation. Mewtwo's actions after leaving the laboratory, the things it did in the aftermath of its escape, are described indirectly rather than cataloged precisely, but the scope of what occurred was sufficient to shape subsequent research, subsequent regulation, subsequent caution about the boundaries of genetic science within this world. The same recent mythologizing process applies to what occurred in the distortion world during the events of the Sinnoh games, to what transpired at the giant chasm in Unova, to what the player witnesses at the altar of the Sune and Moon in Alola. These events are significant enough to change the world around them, and recent enough that the world has not yet fully processed their meaning. The myths they will eventually become have not yet finished forming. What makes this interesting from the perspective of Dark Secrets is that the games ask the player to be present at the formation of these myths. You are there when the cosmology shifts, when the legendary is encountered, when the consequence of ancient or recent action arrives in the present. You participate in events that will be remembered and retold, and eventually simplified into the kind of entry that appears in a Pokédex or a historical text, stripped of the specific experience of being there. The player character who completes these events will presumably go on to exist in a world that talks about what occurred in the way that people talk about significant events, at a remove from the actual experience. The games do not follow that aftermath. They deliver the event and then the credits roll, and the mythology being formed is left to form without further observation. The story of Lavender Town's music, the actual compositional choices behind the notes and frequencies, is worth dwelling on longer than the popular mythology around it. The piece was composed for a specific emotional purpose. The location it accompanies is a graveyard, and the music needed to communicate something about grief and unease and the kind of place a graveyard is, even within a world that is broadly warm and bright. The composer worked within significant technical constraints. The Game Boy hardware of the original games could produce a limited range of sounds through its sound chip, and the music for every location in those games was shaped by what that hardware could accomplish. The Lavender Town theme does not sound the way it sounds by accident. It sounds that way because someone made specific choices about what notes to use, what tempo to set, what patterns to repeat, and what resolution to withhold. The effect that those choices produce is not mystical in origin. It is the result of craft applied to a specific emotional problem. How do you make a location feel different from every other location in a game that is otherwise consistently cheerful? How do you communicate to a young player that this place requires a different kind of attention without using words? The answer was to make music that does not do what music usually does, that withholds the resolution it seems to be building toward, that stays in a state of mild incompletion. The stories that grew up around the Lavender Town theme, the myths about specific frequencies that the game used, the legends about adverse effects on young players, have been examined and found to be urban legend rather than fact. But the fact that these stories emerged and spread and were believed by so many people says something important about the effectiveness of the actual music. Something was genuinely communicated by that composition. People felt something specific in that location. The mythology was an attempt to explain a real effect through an impossible cause. The real cause is simply good craft. Someone understood what that location needed and made something that served that need with precision. The darkness of Lavender Town is earned darkness, produced by skill rather than accident, and that is in some ways more impressive than any supernatural explanation would be. The evolution lines of certain Pokémon carry stories that unfold across their developmental stages in ways that become visible only when you look at all stages together. The routes line is one of these. A group of Pokémon whose development involves significant changes in body and apparent consciousness that the games present without much explanatory apparatus. Ralts is described as capable of sensing human emotions, specifically the positive ones, and gravitating toward places and people that generate warmth and joy. The creature is essentially a receiver tuned to a specific frequency, drawn toward happiness, the way some creatures are drawn toward light or warmth or specific chemical signatures. It feels what the people around it feel, and it seeks the good version of that. Kirlia develops this further, described as dancing when its trainer is happy, its psychic powers growing as the emotional bond between them deepens. The connection between the creature's happiness and its power is stated explicitly in these entries, another instance of the series building emotional states directly into developmental mechanics. The Kirlia that is loved becomes more powerful. The relationship between care and capability is not accidental. Gardevoir, the final evolution of the primary line, is described in terms that the games do not shy away from in their intensity. The creature will give its life for the trainer it has bonded with, not reluctantly, not as a last resort, but with the same commitment that defines every aspect of how it has developed. The entries note that Gardevoir will create a miniature black hole if the situation requires it, distorting space around it in an act of protection whose cost it is apparently willing to pay without reservation. The other evolution, Galad's, develops in a different direction, described as a warrior whose protective instinct is expressed through combat, rather than through the psychic defenses Gardevoir employs. Both forms of the final evolution are protective in nature. Both are described as devoted. The developmental path splits, but the essential character remains constant, which suggests that the character was always there, present in the small green creature that couldn't yet express it, waiting to become what it was eventually going to become. The Pokémon that inhabit volcanic areas have a relationship with destruction that the Pokédex records with characteristic evenness. Slugma and Magcargo are creatures of magma, organisms that exist at temperatures that should preclude biology as the games ordinarily present it. The entries note that Magcargo's body temperature exceeds 10,000 degrees, which is approximately twice the surface temperature of the Sun. If this measurement is taken seriously, the implications for any trainer who has caught and carried one of these creatures are not addressed by the game in any way whatsoever. The games present this fact and move on, which is entirely consistent with how the Pokédex handles information that would destabilize the adventure if it were dwelt upon. The Pokédex is a document that contains facts that cannot be reconciled with the world the games present, and the game's response to this irreconcilability is to record and continue, as though the act of recording is sufficient and the questions the record raises do not need to follow. Typhlosion is described as having a volatile temper that causes spontaneous combustion in the air around it when it is provoked, creating a shimmer of heat that incinerates any attack that reaches it. The creature is essentially a controlled explosion wearing the form of an animal, and the control is apparently conditional on its emotional state. When Typhlosion is calm, the fire is manageable. When it is not, the entries suggest a more dramatic set of circumstances. The fire starters in general carry a design philosophy that puts enormous destructive power in small and appealing packages. Charmander's flame, Chimchar's fire inherited from an ancient ancestor, Fennekin's heat that intensifies under stress, all of these are presented as features to be understood and appreciated rather than as hazards to be managed. The world of Pokémon has decided, as a matter of cultural understanding, that the power is not the danger. The relationship is the management. The bond is the safety system. The Pokémon known as Sableye is described as having no natural weaknesses under the type system as it existed before a generation that changed this, making it the only Pokémon besides Spirit Omb to occupy that particular position for an extended period. The lore around Sableye describes a creature that lives in deep caves and feeds on gemstones, its eyes transformed by the minerals it has consumed into faceted jewels that see in absolute darkness. The original encounter with Sableye in the games placed it in a specific cave with specific significance to its generation's storyline, and the encounter was unexpected enough that players who found it experienced a genuine surprise, the kind that the game's wild encounter system was designed to produce but rarely achieved, as effectively as Sableye's early appearances managed. The creature's design, a small hunched figure with eyes that catch whatever light remains, was precisely calibrated for the cave environment in which it debuted. The entries also note that Sableye is attracted to the spirits of those who venture into its territory, describing behavior that suggests a creature aware of things that other creatures cannot perceive. It moves through darkness, as it is unaffected by techniques that affect every other creature in its categories. Its eyes see in conditions that vision should not function in. The games present this as a coherent set of adaptations rather than a collection of supernatural quirks, and the coherence makes it feel more real than it would if the entries were simply listing unusual abilities without the underlying ecological logic. The decision to give Sableye no weaknesses was eventually walked back by the introduction of a typing that could affect it, and the games incorporated this change into the lore by introducing a scenario in which Sableye required a specific large gemstone to feel completely secure, one large enough to hide behind, suggesting that the confidence the creature's original form projected was not absolute, and that the creature itself understood the limits of its invulnerability in a way the games had not initially acknowledged. There is a quality in the game's treatment of the legendary Pokémon called Kyogre and Groudon that distinguishes their conflict from the conflicts between legendary Pokémon in other generations. These two creatures are described as the embodiments of the sea and the land, not as rulers of those domains or as powerful entities associated with those elements, but as the actual sea and land themselves, as the forces that expanded the oceans and raised the continents in some ancient period that the games frame as mythological. The conflict between them is described as having ended the ancient era, as being so destructive that the world as it then existed could not survive its continuation, and as having been stopped not through victory by either party, but through the intervention of a third force powerful enough to separate them. The separation was not a resolution. The conflict was suspended. The conditions that would allow it to resume were preserved in two ancient artifacts, and the game's story involves the attempt to use those artifacts to reactivate the conflict. What makes this genuinely dark is the scale of what is being described. The games portray the potential destruction of the world's balance between land and sea as a consequence of resuming this conflict. The villain who attempts to use the artifacts is not simply seeking power in the conventional sense, but is acting on an ideology that concludes the world as it exists should be drastically altered, that the version of the world humans have built is not worth preserving. The games oppose this conclusion through the player's actions, but do not engage with the ideology in a way that dismisses it entirely. Someone looked at the world and decided it should be different, decided this with enough conviction to attempt to wake a creature that ended the ancient era. The games ask the player to stop this from happening without requiring the player to understand or refute the logic that led to the attempt. Stopping is sufficient. Understanding is optional. Rayquaz's role in the ancient separation of these two forces is presented as that of a peacemaker, a creature capable of ending the conflict precisely because it exists between the two opposing forces, rather than aligned with either. Its habitat, the sky above both land and sea, positions it as the neutral element in a conflict between irreconcilable poles. The games frame this as appropriate rather than coincidental, suggesting that the world was organized with this balance in mind, that the sky creature was always going to be the one to intervene. The concept of a Pokemon's soul is addressed more directly in some entries than in others, and the directness sometimes reveals considerations the games do not typically pursue to their conclusions. The Litwick line has been discussed in relation to the spirits it absorbs, but the series' engagement with the concept of a soul extends beyond the ghost types that most obviously traffic in this territory. Gardevoir and Galad are described as creatures that would give their lives for their trainer, which implies that those lives are worth giving, that something of significant value is at stake in the act. The Pokemon world's treatment of life and its cessation is primarily oblique, handled through the funeral architecture of places like Lavender Town and Mount, Pyre, and through the ghost types who are associated with what comes after, but the value of the life that might be given up, the nature of what is lost when it is lost, is not addressed directly. The Pokemon known as Giratina is described as existing in antimatter and as having been sent to inhabit the antimatter dimension because of its violent nature. The implication that an entity can exist in antimatter, can have a form and a nature, and apparently a relationship with its situation, suggests that the metaphysics of the Pokemon world extend well beyond the physics that govern ordinary existence. Life in this world is not simply biological. It is something for which biology is only one of several possible substrates. Rotom is a creature described as an electric being, a plasma that possesses machines and alters its nature based on the machine it inhabits. The entries describe the possession as a natural behavior rather than as something unusual, as simply what Rotom does as part of its existence. The machine is temporarily transformed by the creature's presence. When Rotom leaves, the machine returns to its ordinary function. The entry does not describe what the machine experiences during the possession, which is a question the games would presumably consider unanswerable and therefore not worth raising. The Pokemon called Hydreigon is described as a creature that attacks anything that moves, indiscriminately without selection, driven by a hostility that the entries describe as absolute. The heads on its wings are not fully conscious, described as lacking independent intelligence, functioning as additional attack vectors rather than as separate minds. The central head controls the body. The wing heads attack. The system is coherent from a design perspective and genuinely disturbing from a naturalistic one. The entries note that Hydreigon was once regarded as the devil in the mythology of the regions where it appears, that its emergence from the evolution of Dano and Swilus was seen as the manifestation of something essentially destructive. The three-headed dragon, with wings for additional heads and an appetite for attacking everything in range, was the ancient mythology apparently concluded, not something that should exist and that did anyway. This is a pattern in the series that deserves notice. Pokémon that exist in the mythology of their world as figures of terror, as creatures that ancient cultures recognized as dangerous in a way that went beyond ordinary predation, are scattered through the Pokédex entries in ways that complicate the adventure companion framing. Haxorus is described in terms that approach the legendary. Salamence is said to have evolved its wings from the sheer intensity of its desire to fly, which is a mechanism of development that the games never fully explain but clearly find important enough to record. These creatures are available as companions. They battle for trainers who care for them. The relationship between the creature the mythology describes and the creature that follows instructions in battle is one the games manage by simply not addressing the gap. Both things are true. The ancient terror and the trained companion coexist in the same creature, and the adventure assumes they are compatible without requiring either the mythology or the companionship to yield to the other. The region of Galar contains histories of conflict and industrial development that the games treat with a seriousness unusual even for a series that regularly engages with difficult material. The myth of the hero who wielded the legendary sword and shield Pokémon against an ancient threat is layered over a setting that is recognizably industrial, recognizably shaped by the kind of extraction economy that produces both prosperity and damage. The games do not make the political reading explicit, but the setting invites it. The darkest day referenced in Galar's mythology is described as a period when a giant Pokémon appeared and threatened the entire region, when the sky darkened and the normal order of things stopped functioning. The myth describes the hero as having stopped this threat, as having wielded something powerful enough to bring the giant creature under control and end the period of darkness. What the games reveal about this mythology is that it is incomplete in specific ways. The crisis was stopped, but the mechanism used to stop it is one that had side effects extending thousands of years into the future, one that altered the Pokémon of the region in ways that continue to be felt, one that the people of Galar have been living with without fully understanding. The prosperity and the damage are both the legacy of that ancient intervention. The game's villain attempts to recreate the darkest day deliberately, believing that the power it would generate is worth the harm it would cause, that the goal pursued justifies the method used. This is a structure the games return to repeatedly across multiple generations, the figure who has decided that the damage is acceptable given what is being attempted, and the player character who stops this without the games requiring the player to fully understand or refute the logic, only to prevent the consequence. The Pokémon known as Marshadow was introduced as a mythical creature that inhabits the shadows of others, described as watching and learning from those whose shadows it enters. The creature is drawn to those who work hard, to those whose effort and striving create a kind of shadow worth inhabiting. The intimacy of the described behavior, a creature that lives in your shadow, that watches from that position, that learns from the effort you put into your days, is not treated as threatening by the entries, but the proximity it implies is worth pausing on. The game's treatment of mythical Pokémon differs from their treatment of legendary ones in ways that are sometimes subtle and sometimes pronounced. Mythical Pokémon tend to be presented as smaller, more personal, more connected to individual stories, rather than to the grand cosmological narratives that the legendaries anchor. They are creatures whose significance is measured in moments and relationships, rather than in epics and elemental forces. Shaymin, a small hedgehog-shaped creature, carries the ability to purify polluted environments, described as absorbing the poison from contaminated areas and releasing clean air and flowers in its place. The entry notes that Shaymin changes form when it is touched by gratitude, when the emotional state of those around it shifts into thankfulness, becoming something more radically different when the atmosphere around it reaches that specific quality. The relationship between Shaymin and gratitude is a small piece of what the series does throughout with the connection between emotional states and physical transformation. The world of Pokémon takes feelings seriously at a biological level, encoding them into the mechanisms of change and development in ways that suggest the world was designed with emotional reality as a fundamental parameter. What is felt matters here. It matters in ways that can be measured and observed and cataloged by someone paying careful attention. The legendary Pokémon of the Johto region, the 3 legendary beasts, carry specific histories that the games present through environmental storytelling and the accounts of an elder in Ecruteak City. The tower that burned, the 3 creatures who died inside it, the restoration performed by Ho-Oh. These facts are established clearly enough that the player understands the mythology, even if they are encountering it for the first time. What the Elder's account adds is the observation that the 3 legendary beasts now run. They do not remain in one place. They do not inhabit a fixed location in the way that many legendary Pokémon inhabit specific dungeons or towers. They move through the region, appearing and disappearing, pursuing or fleeing or simply traveling through the landscape they once lived and died in and were restored to. The running has been interpreted in various ways by players and theorists over the years. Some read it as joy, as the expression of gratitude for restored existence. Some read it as flight, as the continuation of some ancient motion that began in the fire and has never quite finished. Some read it as searching, as the behavior of creatures looking for something they lost in the transformation between what they were and what they became. The games do not specify. The beasts run. The player can chase them, can encounter them repeatedly across the region in brief and difficult meetings, can eventually catch one if the pursuit is persistent enough. The catching is an end to the running, or perhaps only a pause, depending on how you read the relationship between a creature that exists to move and the small sphere that holds it still. Suicune specifically among the three carries a particular association with water and with the purification of it. The creature is described as running across the surface of water, as facing north, as being drawn to the direction associated in certain traditions with beginnings and purity and the source of things. The purification of polluted water that Suicune is said to perform is a task it conducts as it moves, leaving cleaner water behind it in the landscape. The image is beautiful and also quietly significant. A creature that was killed by fire, restored by what the games present as genuine divine power, now moves through the world doing something constructive with its restored existence, cleaning what has been made dirty, moving toward a purity it cannot perhaps achieve, but continues to pursue anyway. The myth carries a weight that is easy to miss if you are moving through the game quickly. Entei is associated with volcanoes, and with an intensity that the entries describe as physical, as heat that emanates from the creature and is perceptible to those nearby. A new volcano is said to erupt somewhere in the world every time Entei roars. This is presented as a natural consequence of the creature's existence, rather than as an act of aggression or even intention. The world responds to Entei's voice, the way the world responds to pressure finding release. The creature cannot help what its presence causes. This returns to the theme that runs through so many of the darker elements of the series, the idea of a being that exists as itself, fully and completely, and whose existence has consequences that the being neither chooses nor can prevent. Entei roars and volcanoes form. This is not something Entei does so much as something that happens when Entei is. The distinction is subtle, but the games maintain it. The city of Sootopolis in Hoenn exists inside a dormant volcano's crater, its rim forming the walls of a walled community accessible only from the water or through a narrow cave. The origin myth of the city and the cave that leads to it are connected to the legendary battles between Kyogre and Groudon in a way that the games treat as ancient history, as something that shaped the landscape long before anyone now living was alive. The Cave of Origin, which sits within Sootopolis, is described as the place where life first appeared on the land. The name is direct in a way that is unusual for the series. Not the cave of ancient things or the cave of the old power, but the origin, the place where something began. The legendary Pokémon that was involved in ending the ancient battle is found here during the game's climax, resting in the place from which everything apparently started. There is something in this geography that rewards attention. The place where life began is also the place where the battle that nearly ended life was last waged. Beginning and ending are located in the same physical space, and the cave has persisted through the interval between them, maintaining some quality that keeps drawing the most significant things in the world back to it. The game does not explain what this quality is. It simply places the origin and the crisis in the same location and lets the player inhabit that space. The people of Sotopolis live inside what was once a volcano's caldera. The ground beneath them is volcanic. The walls around them were formed by an ancient geological event that is still visible in the material those walls are made of. They have built their community inside the evidence of a catastrophe, and they live there contentedly, because what the catastrophe left behind is also beautiful, and sometimes what remains after tremendous force spends itself is something that can be inhabited. The later generations of Pokémon games have returned repeatedly to the theme of ultra-dimensional travel and the entities it brings into contact with the ordinary world. The Ultra Beast is introduced in Alola, were the most explicit version of this theme, but the concept of things entering the world from elsewhere, from dimensions with different rules and different physics, runs through the series in ways that predate that generation's formal treatment of it. The Unknown are an early version of this, creatures whose form resembles letters and whose behavior and origin the games have never fully explained across the many years and multiple games in which they appear. They inhabit a dimension accessible through specific locations. They gather in configurations that may or may not have significance, and the games have consistently presented them as mysterious without ever converting that mystery into explanation. The theory that has surrounded the Unknown for decades is that they represent a kind of primordial psychic energy, that their letter-like forms are not accidental, but reflective of something about the relationship between symbol and meaning in the Pokémon world. The games have occasionally used the Unknown in plot-critical ways, suggesting they have the capacity to make manifest the things that people believe or fear intensely, that the energy they embody is responsive to focused consciousness. The darkest version of this possibility appears in the Pokémon Crystal Era storyline and its associated film, where the imagination of a child shapes reality through unknown influence, and the shaping runs out of the child's control, producing a situation where what was wished for becomes something the wisher cannot undo. The games and the film that expanded this story handled it with appropriate seriousness, treating the situation not as a villain's scheme, but as the consequence of unconstrained wishing in a world where some forms of wishing have consequences that can be felt. The unknown remain unexplained. They remain in every game that includes them as a category of encounter available to those who search in the right places. Their letter forms glow in the underground spaces they inhabit. Whatever they represent, whatever their presence in the world means for the nature of that world, has been left as an ongoing open question across the entire history of the series. The question of what happens to Pokémon in the wild, outside the protection of training relationships, is handled sporadically across the series, but consistently enough to form a picture that complicates the image of the Pokémon world as a paradise. Wild Pokémon have predator-prey relationships. They compete for territory. They have natural enemies and natural vulnerabilities. They live in a world that does not extend to them the protection that the adventure system provides. The entries for Beedrill describe a creature that will pursue and sting anything that approaches its nest with a fury that stops only when the threat is entirely out of range. The entries for Fearow describe a predatory bird that will stab at anything with its long beak. The entries for Arbok describe the patterns on its hood as functional, as used to terrify prey into stillness before the creature closes in. These are ordinary accounts of predatory behavior, but they sit alongside the adventure framing in ways that the games never quite reconcile. When a player uses a Pokémon to feint another Pokémon in battle, the feinting is presented as a mercy mechanic, a convention that the games have maintained since their beginning. Pokémon do not die in these games, except when the mythology says they did, and the player is meant to feel the weight of that exception. But the wild population of Pokémon is not playing by these rules. The Arbok is actually going through the process that its entries describe. The Beedrill is actually pursuing. The games do not dwell on this inconsistency. They maintain it, but they do not call attention to it, allowing the player to exist in the protected version of the world that the adventure provides, while the Pokédex continues to describe the unprotected version with its characteristic evenness. The stories of specific trainers who appear in the games, the characters encountered as you travel through each region, occasionally carry more weight than the framing suggests. The gym leaders and Elite Four members are typically presented as challenges, as tests on the path to the championship. But the games sometimes embed in these characters' histories that are more complex than the role of obstacle would require. The character known as Sydney in the Hoenn Elite Four is described in his game as someone who was considered a problem child for as long as he can remember, someone whose natural aptitude and interest lay in the darker types of Pokémon, someone who found acceptance and purpose in the competitive environment of the Elite Four rather than in the ordinary social structures that never quite fit him. His characterization is brief, delivered in the few lines of dialogue available before and after the battle with him, but it gestures toward a history. The pattern of a character finding their place in the Pokémon world through the specific Pokémon they are drawn to is one the games use throughout their character design. The Dark-type specialist, who was a problem child. The Ghost-type specialist, who lives in a tower. The Ice-type specialist, in the remote northern location. The types characters work with often reflect something about how they relate to the world, and the darker type specialists often have backstories that touch on isolation or difficulty. What the games do with these backstories is generally the same thing they do with the Pokédex entries that carry dark content. They note it. They let it exist. They do not build dramatic structure around it or require the player to process it emotionally. The information is there, and the player's engagement with it is left to the player. The generation that introduced Galar brought with it a form of Pokémon called Eternatus, described as having arrived on Earth from space 50 million years ago, and whose energy powers the Dynamax and Gigantamax phenomena that define the region's relationship with its Pokémon. The creature crashed into the planet and has been dormant since, and the energy released by its presence has shaped the biology of an entire region's Pokémon population across millions of years. The games present the discovery of Eternatus as a crisis, as the activation of something that should have remained dormant, something that, when active, has effects on the Pokémon around it that are described as dangerous and out of control. The villain of those games is attempting to use Eternatus as an energy source, to harness what it produces for practical purposes, without fully understanding or accounting for the consequences of doing so. This is another instance of the series' recurring theme about the relationship between immense power and the question of whether that power should be used. The games consistently position the attempt to extract and deploy the power of the legendaries as something that goes wrong, not because the legendaries are hostile to being used, but because the power involved exceeds what human structures can contain and direct safely. Eternatus's history as a creature that arrived from space and reshaped the biology of a region simply by being present, without intent, without action, purely through the passive radiation of its energy, is a dark story about consequences without agents. No one decided to alter the Pokémon of Galar. A creature crashed and lay dormant, and the energy it radiated did what energy does when it encounters living systems over millions of years. The history of the region was shaped by an accident too large and too distant for anyone to have prevented. There are moments in the games where the darkness is not embedded in lore or mythology, but in the emotional texture of what is being described, in the way certain encounters or certain revelations sit differently than the surrounding adventure material. The moment in Pokémon Platinum where you encounter the event that closes the Distortion World sequence, where a specific character's grief and loss are made real in a way that the game does not prepare you for, is one of these moments. The games have always been willing to use grief as a narrative element to place loss in their stories in ways that the adventure format acknowledges and then moves past. The child player moving through these games encounters this material and is not necessarily equipped with the frameworks to process it that an adult player might bring, and the games proceed anyway, trusting that the encounter will do what it can do and that the player will carry it forward in whatever way serves them. This is not carelessness. The games are aware of their audience and aware of what they are placing before that audience. The choice to include these moments, to write the grief of Cubone and the isolation of Darkrai and the waiting of Red into a children's adventure game, is a considered one. The games believe that encountering these things in a context that is fundamentally safe, fundamentally governed by the player's own progress and choices, has value. That the encounter with something genuinely sad, genuinely strange, genuinely dark, in a world that is broadly supportive, teaches something that could not be taught any other way. The dark secrets of Pokémon are not accidents or oversights. They are an argument about what children's entertainment can hold, about what it should hold, about the poverty of a world that contains only brightness. The argument is made implicitly through the placement of these elements in the same world as the friendship and the adventure, without explanation, without apology. The relationship between Pokémon typing and the mythologies that underlie them is worth exploring at length, because the type system is not simply a mechanical convenience. It is a way of organizing the world into categories that reflect something about the nature of what exists within it, and the darker implications of that organization surface in interesting ways when you look at the types associated with the most difficult material in the Pokédex. Ghost-type Pokémon, as a category, communicates something about the world's understanding of what persists after the end of things. The type does not have a clean, real-world analog. It is not simply a category for scary creatures or for creatures that look unsettling. It is a category specifically for creatures that exist at the boundary between states of being, for creatures that are associated with the process of ending and with what comes after. The games have built this type consistently across every generation, always grounding it in the same basic understanding. Dark-type Pokémon occupy a different conceptual space. In the original Japanese classification system, they were called evil-type, which is a more direct statement of what the category was understood to contain. The localization to dark softened this somewhat, broadening the category from a specific moral quality to a more general category of things associated with night and shadow, and the less acknowledged aspects of experience. Both framings are visible in the Pokémon that occupy the category: creatures associated with cunning, with the night, with things that operate outside the visible and the acknowledged. Fairy type, introduced considerably later in the series, carries its own understated darkness. The fairy in its original folkloric form is not a benign creature. The fairy traditions that the type draws on are full of entities that steal children, that lure travelers off safe paths, that offer gifts with conditions attached that the recipient cannot anticipate. The light and charming visual presentation of many fairy-type Pokémon does not exclude these darker associations. The games occasionally acknowledge them in the Pokédex entries of specific fairy-type creatures, noting behaviors that connect to the older, less comfortable version of what fairies are. Sylveon, the fairy-type evolution of Eevee, is described in its Pokédex entries as using its ribbon-like feelers to wrap around a target and soothe it, to calm even the most aggressive opponents and stop battles before they escalate. The descriptions of Sylveon's ability to pacify are sometimes slightly unsettling in their specificity. The creature is capable of ending aggression in others by physical contact and the release of something into the air around them, something that calms regardless of whether the calmed creature wants to be calmed. The games present this as a positive quality, as evidence of Sylvian's gentle nature, the ability to calm everything around you, to end conflict through your presence, is framed as a gift rather than as a form of control. The distinction between calming and controlling is one the games do not examine, which is consistent with how they handle these things. They describe the behavior. The categorization is left to the player. Cernias, the Kalos legendary previously mentioned in relation to the ultimate weapon, is described as being able to share eternal life with those it chooses. The Pokédex entries note that when the time comes for Xerneas to sleep, it transforms into a tree and rests for 1,000 years. The 1,000-year cycle of rest and waking is a kind of immortality that the creature imposes on itself, a pattern that has presumably repeated many times across the creature's existence. The creature is described as bringing life and vitality, as being associated with forests and growth and the renewal that follows dormancy. All of this is characteristically beautiful within the series' handling of its most significant legendary Pokémon. The darkness in Xerneas is in the story of what its power was used for, in the history of the ultimate weapon, in the way the most positive of qualities, the ability to sustain and renew life, was channeled into a tool of destruction. The creature's nature was not changed by that use. The nature was always generative. The direction in which the generation was applied was the variable, and the variable was controlled by whoever held the relevant artifact. The game's history is full of instances where the technology of the Pokémon world intersects with the mythological in ways that the series treats with uneven depth. The Sylph Company Tower in the original games, the Devon Corporation in Hoenn, the Macrocosmos Corporation in Galar, all of these are entities whose research and development activities have implications that extend into the mythological and the dangerous. The most powerful technology in these worlds tends to be the technology closest to the legendary creatures. The Master Ball that Sylph Company developed, the Eon Flute that Devon Corporation created, the mechanisms through which various organizations have attempted to control legendary and mythical Pokémon all represent the same pattern. Human ingenuity applied to the problem of commanding forces that the mythology frames as fundamentally beyond human command. The games consistently penalize this ambition, not because the ingenuity is wrong, but because the application is inappropriate, because there is a category of power in this world that should not be commanded and that responds badly to the attempt. The criminal organizations that recur across the generations are in some ways the clearest expression of this pattern. The groups that have decided the legendary Pokémon are assets to be acquired and deployed, rather than forces to be acknowledged and respected. The games position these groups as antagonists, but the games also take their ambitions seriously enough to allow them to nearly succeed in ways that demonstrate why the ambition was possible to hold. What keeps the criminal organizations from succeeding is typically not superior force, but something closer to legitimacy, to the existence of relationships between humans and Pokémon that the criminal organizations cannot replicate because they do not actually participate in. The legendary Pokémon respond to the player character, to the ally characters, to the gym leaders and champions and researchers who have spent their lives in genuine engagement with the Pokémon world, in ways they do not respond to the commands of those who seek to use them. The games make this argument through the mechanics of the endgame encounters, through the narrative structure in which the genuine relationship always proves sufficient and the attempted control always proves insufficient. It is an argument about the nature of power and the conditions under which power can be meaningfully held, made through the structure of an adventure game and felt before it is understood. The region of Sinnoh contains archaeological and mythological material that exceeds in density what most other regions include, and the games that take place They are among the most willing in the series to engage with the largest questions their mythology opens. The creation myth of the Pokémon world, the story of Arceus and the origin of everything, is told through Sinnoh's ruins and its research culture, through academics and explorers who have spent their careers piecing together what the oldest records say. The Pokémon known as Uxie is described as having given knowledge to humanity, as being the source of the cognitive capacities that allow humans to be what they are. The entries note that before Uxie's gift, the ancestors of the people of this world were not as they are now. The gift was apparently a discrete event, a specific addition to what human beings were capable of. Uxie carrying out this role is presented without drama, simply recorded as a fact about the history of the world, something that happened the way the formation of mountains happened, as part of the arrangement of things. Mesprit gave emotion to humanity. Azelf gave willpower. The three aspects of conscious experience that the games identify as fundamental, knowing, feeling, and choosing, were each given to people by a specific being that continues to exist in the world, that can be encountered in specific lakes, that can be caught and carried and used in battle by the player who finds them. The players who catch these creatures are carrying within their teams the entities responsible for everything that makes human experience what it is. The games do not pause on this. The legendary fairies of Sinnoh are powerful Pokémon like other powerful Pokémon, and their role in the history of conscious experience does not prevent them from being addressed through the normal mechanics of encounter and capture. The cosmological significance and the gameplay function coexist without the games asking you to find that juxtaposition strange. The question of what Pokémon know about their own nature is one the games have always addressed indirectly through their mechanics, through the systems that govern how Pokémon develop and what they respond to, rather than through explicit acknowledgement. But certain Pokédex entries gesture toward a self-awareness in specific creatures that makes the question unavoidable. Alakazam is described as having a perfect memory and an IQ that is consistently estimated at levels that would represent the highest end of any measurable intelligence. The creature remembers everything that has ever happened to it from the moment it was born. It retains complete cognitive access to every experience, every training session, every battle, every moment in the company of the trainer who carries it. This is not presented as a burden by the games, but the entries also do not characterize it as straightforwardly pleasant. Slowbro and Slowking are creatures whose intelligence is described as having been enhanced by the shelter clamped to them, by the chemical or energetic relationship between themselves and the creature attached to their bodies. The enhancement is real. The creature to which the enhancement belongs is also real and continues to exist in its attached state. What the entries rarely address is what the shelter experiences in this arrangement, whether the creature that enhanced Slowbro or Slowking retains any awareness of its situation. The arrangement is presented as mutually beneficial, as a form of symbiosis. The games do not describe it in terms that invite discomfort, but the shelter that bites Slowpoke in the process of triggering evolution is thereafter part of the evolved creature, and what that means for the shelter's independence and experience is a question the entries decline to examine. The Pokédex records the arrangement, the recording is complete, the analysis is yours. The mythology of the Regi group, touched on earlier, connects to a broader pattern in the games of created beings whose creators are absent. The golems were made by something. What made them is not present in the world as it currently exists. The maker left behind what it made, and what it made has persisted in the landscape of Hoenn as sealed away potential, enormous power contained in specific structures, because someone decided the power should not circulate freely. The absence of the creator is a theme that surfaces throughout the series' treatment of its ancient and legendary material. Arceus created the aspects of the universe and the bodies that govern them, and then became dormant, accessible only at a specific location under specific conditions, present in the world, but not active in it in the way a governing intelligence would be active. The universe it made continues. The arrangement it established persists. The maker rests at the Hall of Origin. What this means for the beings that were made is a question the games approach through character rather than through philosophy. The legendary Pokémon that exist in the world that Arceus arranged do not appear to be oriented toward the maker or toward the questions that the maker's existence raises. They are engaged with the things they were made to be engaged with, on time and space and antimatter, and the lakes and the sky and the ocean floor, the domains that correspond to their natures. The thing that created those natures is resting. The natures continue to do what they do. The world runs on the arrangement without the arranger's active participation. This is either a beautiful description of a system that was made well enough to sustain itself, or a quiet observation about absence at the top of a cosmological structure that extends all the way down to the Cubone crying at the full moon. Both readings are available. The games do not choose between them. The connection between the dark secrets and the bright surfaces of the Pokémon games is not one of contrast, but of continuity. The same world that contains Yamask and its grief contains also the Pikachu that cheers in a Pokémon Center when it is healed. The same region that has Lavender Town also has Celadon City, with its department store and its bright music and its sense that the world is large and full of things to discover. These are not different aspects of two different games. They are different aspects of the same world, held together by the consistent tone that the series uses, whether it is describing something beautiful or something difficult. That consistent tone is one of the series' most significant achievements, and it is visible precisely because it holds across the full range of what the games include. The Pokédex does not change its register between an entry about a creature that eats honey and an entry about a creature that consumes the spirits of those who come too close. The same calm, scientific, observational voice reports both facts. The world accommodates both facts without the voice suggesting that one is more remarkable or more disturbing than the other. This evenness is what allows the dark secrets to function as they do. If the games raised their voice when they reached the difficult material, if the register shifted to signal that this entry requires special handling, the entries would lose their power. But the power comes from the lack of distinction. The power comes from the world treating the grief of Cubone and the diet of Snorlax as equally real, equally recordable, equally part of what this world is. The adventure that takes you through this world asks you to engage with all of it, to travel through Lavender Town on your way somewhere else, to read the Pokédex entry for Phantump if you choose to read it, to notice the journals in the burned mansion on Cinnabar Island if you take the time to go inside. None of it is required. All of it is there. The world is complete whether you engage with all of it or only with the parts that are most immediately relevant to the journey you're on. There is a Pokémon in the Galar region called Runerigus whose origin story sits among the darkest in the series' recent history. The creature is described as an ancient clay tablet on which a terrible grudge has been inscribed. It is not an ordinary ghost haunting an ordinary object. It is a grudge that used the clay as a body, a resentment so concentrated and so persistent that it developed the capacity to animate matter and use it. The Pokédex entries note that Runerigus pulls those who come too close into its body through the runes on its surface, trapping them within the clay. The entries do not describe what happens to those who are pulled in or whether they can be retrieved. The creature moves through the world as ancient stone marked with writing, and the writing is the most important part of it, the origin and the engine of what it does. What makes Runerigus distinctive within the pattern of objects animated by strong emotion is the specificity of the emotion involved. This is not love persisting, not grief extending, not loneliness finding a form. It is a grudge, a specific directed negative feeling concentrated enough over long enough a period to become a creature. The permanence of resentment is a dark concept for the games to embed in an encounter Pokémon, but the games embed it and move on. The games around Galar are particularly interested in the emotions and experiences that survive transformation. Poltergeist is a ghost haunting a cup of tea, described as having developed from genuine antique tea sets rather than recent productions, implying that certain objects accumulate something over time that makes them more amenable to haunting. The age of the object matters. The history embedded in it matters. The ghost finds a home in things that have a past. The Pokémon called Eternatus, visited earlier in relation to the Darkest Day, carries a detail in its Pokédex entries that places it in a specific tradition within the series' treatment of ancient power. The creature arrived from space and has been present in the Earth of the Pokémon world for 50 million years. The people of Galar have been living with the consequences of its arrival for the entire duration of their region's habitation of that landscape, and they were not aware of what they were living with. This is a pattern that the series repeats in various forms. The thing that shapes a place is not understood by the people shaped by it. The foundational force of Galar's relationship with Pokémon, the reason the Dynamax phenomenon exists, the reason the Pokémon of that region have the relationship they have with their environment, is an entity that crashed from space millions of years ago and has been radiating its energy into the world ever since, without anyone knowing what it was or what was happening. The discovery of Eternatus in the game's story is framed as a crisis precisely because the thing being discovered was not neutral. Waking it, or activating it, drawing it into the present rather than leaving it in its dormant state, produced consequences that required immediate intervention. The games consistently treat the discovery of ancient power as the beginning of an emergency rather than as a neutral event, which reflects their consistent position on the relationship between human ambition and the things in the world that are larger than what humans were meant to manage. The concept of a Pokémon's anger, as distinct from its predatory behavior or its natural defensive responses, is handled in certain entries with a directness that the games generally maintain at a carefully calibrated level. Gyarados is described as being destructive when it rages, described as destroying everything in its path, described as continuing until the target of its anger is no longer there. The entries note that a Gyarados rampage has historically leveled entire cities. This is presented as a quality of Gyarados rather than as aberrant behavior. The creature is what it is, and what it is includes this capacity. The game makes Gyarados available as a companion, trains players to work with it, positions it as one of the more powerful and valuable Pokémon a player can carry. The city-destroying capacity and the training relationship are both real. The games do not require you to reconcile them. Tyranitar is described in its entries as capable of changing the geography of a location simply by moving through it, described as leaving craters and flattened mountains in its wake, as moving through the landscape with a contempt for geography that the entries describe as characteristic rather than exceptional. The creature does not rage. It simply moves, and the moving is enough to do what it does to the land around it. The calmness of Tyranitar's entries is what makes them darker than the Gyarados entries in a certain way. Gyarados destroys in anger, which is comprehensible even if the scale is extreme. Tyranitar rearranges geography as a side effect of existing without particular emotional investment in the rearrangement. The world changes because Tyranitar passes through it. The indifference is the unsettling part. The Pokémon world's history is longer than any single game presents directly, and the way the games gesture toward that depth is through the material they include about civilizations that no longer exist and events that happened before any character in the current story was alive. The ruins that appear in various regions, the ancient texts that specific characters have devoted their lives to translating, the legendary Pokémon whose histories extend millions of years into the past, all of these are evidence of a world with a deep past that the current era can access only imperfectly. The unknown, those mysterious letter-shaped creatures, inhabit a dimension that various researchers have spent careers attempting to understand. The dimension is connected to the main world through specific points, specific caves or ruins, and the unknown move through it in ways that the games describe without ever fully explaining. The creatures have been present in the world since before any current civilization existed. The alphabet forms they take predate the alphabets they resemble. The question of which came first, the unknown or the letters, is one the games raise and do not answer. The ruin maniac characters that appear in various regions are trainers who have devoted their lives to excavating and studying ancient sites. The games characterize them with affection as eccentrics, as people who have gone perhaps too far in their devotion to the past. But the devotion is never treated as futile. The ruins contain things worth finding. The past of the Pokémon world is rich enough to justify the devotion. What the ruins reveal when they are excavated and studied is a picture of a world that has contained enormous power for an enormous length of time, that has been shaped and reshaped by forces the current era can only document rather than understand, that is older than any mythology currently circulating in it is old enough to remember. The dark secrets of the Pokémon world are not only in the Pokédex, they are in the geology. They are in the depth of what lies beneath the routes you walk and the cities you visit, the weight of all the history that preceded you. The region of Paldea, the most recently detailed in the series at the time of this telling, introduced a concept of time that the series had not quite handled before, actual time travel as a plot element, rather than as a mechanical implication of certain legendary Pokémon. The creatures Area Zero is named for, the Paradox Pokémon, are described as either ancient forms of modern species or future forms of them, arriving through a mechanism that the game's story gradually reveals. What makes this particular dark corner of Paldea's mythology worth noting is what it implies about the relationship between what exists now and what existed before and what will exist after. The ancient Paradox Pokémon are not simply predecessors of familiar species. They are recognizably the same creature, seen at an angle of time that makes them look different. The teeth are longer, the limbs are different, the behavior is different. But the essential creature is continuous, across the span of time between the ancient form and the modern one. This raises questions about identity and change that the games handle with their characteristic light touch, placing the philosophical weight in the structure of the encounters rather than in dialogue that would explain it. You encounter something that is your Pokémon seen from a different direction of time. You have a relationship with what it is in this moment. The other version is a stranger that shares the essential shape. The game asks you to engage with both without resolving the relationship between them. The final territories of every game, the locations that hold what the player has been working toward across the entire journey, carry a gravity that the games produce through a combination of music, visual design, and the accumulated weight of everything that preceded them. Victory Road in the original games. The final stretch of each regional championship path. These places are built to feel like a rival, like the culmination of a particular kind of sustained effort. What is waiting at the end of those roads is also the end of the dark secrets, in a sense, or at least their most concentrated presence. The champion teams that provide the final test are built to be genuinely difficult, to represent the full development of what the player's relationship with their Pokemon should have produced by the time they have traveled that far. The battle is a measurement, and the dark secrets are in some sense what earned the player the standing to take that measurement. Every moment spent reading a Pokédex entry instead of skipping past it, every time a player stopped in Lavender Town and let the music settle instead of rushing through, every encounter with a legendary Pokémon that was treated as the significant event it was, rather than simply another catch to add to the collection. All of this is part of what the journey meant. The dark secrets are not separate from the adventure. They are part of the texture of the world that the adventure moves through, and moving through a world with full attention to its texture is different from moving through it with attention only to the destinations. The Pokémon series has always offered both kinds of travel: the speed run and the deep read, the championship sprint and the slow exploration of every cave and every Pokédex entry, and every character who has something to say if you talk to them twice. The dark secrets are primarily available to the second kind of traveler, to the one who is not only moving toward the end, but is genuinely present in every part of the journey that connects one end to the other. The dimension of time in the Pokémon world carries implications that the games have consistently declined to fully explore but regularly gesture toward. Celebi, a creature that moves freely through time, that appears across every era, is described as inhabiting forests simultaneously in the past and the future, and the present. What this means for the forests themselves, for the landscape that plays host to a creature whose relationship with time is not sequential, is not addressed. The games that allow the player to travel to the past, whether through the mechanisms of specific legendary Pokémon or through the plot devices of specific games, always treat that travel as a feature rather than as a philosophical problem. What does it mean to exist in the past? What is the relationship between what you change and what you return to? These are questions that the games decline to pursue in depth, which is the correct decision for a game that needs to function as an adventure rather than as a philosophical exercise. But the questions exist at the edge of every time travel narrative the series includes. Dialga, the creature of time, is described as making time flow through its heartbeat. If time flows through Dialga's heartbeat, then the experience of time in the Pokémon world is not a backdrop against which events occur, but an active quality produced by a specific creature's existence. The past exists because Dialga produced it. The future will exist because Dialga continues. The present is the leading edge of the heartbeat. What happened to time in the Pokémon world during the events of the Sinnoh games, when Dialga was drawn into conflict and the normal flow of things was disrupted, is something the games handle as a crisis that the player resolves rather than as a question to be dwelt on. The disruption ends. The heartbeat returns to its normal pattern. The world continues. The nature of what time is, and what Dialga's role in it, means for the experience of everyone living in that world remains in the background, noted rather than examined. The Pokémon known as Gengar carries a history in the series that spans its entire length, one of the original encounters that players have been having since the very first games, a creature that has been present in every generation and every region in some form. The Pokédex entries for Gengar across the decades accumulate into a portrait that is more unsettling than any single entry captures. It was once human. It is aware of this. It hides in the shadows of others and mimics the temperature drop of fear. It grins because it is waiting for something, though the entries differ on exactly what. Some describe it as waiting to drag those who are frightened into its shadow, to add them to the darkness it inhabits. Others describe it as simply taking pleasure in the fear it produces, as though the producing of fear is itself the thing it is seeking. The grin is constant. The creature is almost always depicted with the wide grin that has defined its visual design since the original game's sprite established it. The grin is described in the entries as the expression of a creature that is pleased by something, that has arrived at an arrangement with its situation that produces something like contentment. Whether that contentment is earned or simply adopted from habit is not addressed. The grin is there. It has always been there. Whatever it means, it persists. The persistence of Gengar is notable on a meta level, as well as a narrative one. The creature has been present in every iteration of the Pokémon concept, always in the same role, always with the same essential character, always with the grin. It has survived more changes to the games than almost any other creature in the series. Whatever it represents within the world's mythology, it has proven durable. It has lasted through every revision, every new generation, every updated visual style. The shadow stays. There is something that the games do in their treatment of specific gym leaders and champions that represents a quieter form of the dark secrets, one that does not appear in Pokédex entries or legendary mythology, but in the characterization of specific figures encountered during the journey. These are the characters who have reached the top of the competitive structure and have found that the top of the competitive structure is a specific kind of place. The champion is not simply the strongest trainer. The champion is the one who remained after everyone else moved on or fell short. The champion is the end point of a system that produces one occupant of that position at any given time, and occupying it means being the last test for every player who reaches the final stage. It is a lonely role, structurally. The position exists to be challenged. Every relationship the champion has with arriving trainers is defined in advance by that structure. They are here to test. The test is the relationship. Lance, the champion of the Indigo League, is a character the games have returned to across multiple generations, always as a significant figure, always with the same essential presentation. He is serious. He is powerful. He has seen enough of the world to have opinions about it that the games occasionally allow him to express. The darkness that surrounds him is the darkness of someone who has been the endpoint of the system for a very long time and has made a life of that position because it is the life available. Cynthia, the champion of Sinnoh, is characterized as someone who is as interested in mythology and research as in battle, who has spent her standing as champion in pursuit of understanding the world she inhabits, rather than simply in maintenance of her championship title. The games present her as formidable and as genuinely engaged with the mysteries that the region's mythology opens. She is a reader of the dark secrets, in some sense, someone whose interest in the Pokémon world extends into the places the games have always told you are worth looking. The patterns of the dark secrets, assembled across all of the game's generations and regions, form something that is coherent enough to be called a philosophy, though the games would not call it that. The philosophy is simple. The world contains things that are difficult and beautiful in approximately equal measure. The difficult things are worth knowing about, and knowing about them does not diminish the beauty of the beautiful things, but rather makes both more real. This is an unusual position for entertainment media aimed at children, and it is part of what has made the Pokémon series as durable as it has been. Children who grew up with these games have carried the things they found in them into adulthood, and the things they found were not only the joy of catching creatures and winning battles. They were also the grief of Cubone, and the loneliness of Darkrai, and the unsettling music of Lavender Town, and the entry for Phantump, and all the other pieces of the world that the games placed with the same care they placed the bright things. The series trusted its audience. It trusted that the people playing these games could hold both things, could carry the full weight of the world being presented without being crushed by the darker parts of it. That trust was extended to children who had not necessarily been trusted with that kind of material before, and the children by and large held it. They carried it forward. They are the adults now who return to these games and find the weight still there, still manageable, still part of what made the games what they were. The dark secrets of Pokémon are a record of that trust, evidence that someone believed the players were capable of a world that was honest rather than only safe, capable of an adventure that included grief and isolation and the unsettling alongside everything that made the journey worth taking. That belief has been honored across more than 25 years of games, in more regions than any single player has visited, through more generations than the original creators could have anticipated needing to build. The quietest dark secret of all is not in any single entry or any particular mythology. It is in the structure of the games themselves, in the way they are built to be returned to be played again, in new ways with new attention, to reveal things on the second journey that were invisible on the first. The dark secrets are not accessible to the player who is moving through the games as quickly as possible toward the championship. They are accessible to the player who wanders, who reads, who takes the time to talk to characters twice, who notices that the music of a particular location shifts when something changes in the story. Every route walked twice is a different route. Every entry read carefully is a different entry. And every journey through the world these games built, taken with full attention, is a journey through something that was made with the same full attention in return. That exchange between the care that went into the making and the care that goes into the experiencing is what the dark secrets have always been an invitation to. They are the proof that the making was serious. They are the reward for taking the receiving seriously too. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet moments, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you again.